This tax subcommittee hearing, and thank you, Mr. Plowden, for joining us today. We are here to discuss a matter critical to our nation's economic success. Perhaps it became innocently enough. The U.S. had just enacted a historic reform of our tax laws, including the world's first global minimum tax, which only applied to U.S. companies. Now, at the same time, a few European countries were beginning to target some of our largest and fastest growing companies with discriminatory taxes known as digital service taxes, or DSTs. And I got to tell you, I have a glossary here. For those of you that are fans of acronyms, I am not. I wish we could just say exactly what we're talking about, but to save time, I won't go through all that. Look, the original idea of engaging in negotiations at the OECD was this. Other countries could join the U.S. with their own global minimum taxes, and we could stop the proliferation of DSTs. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. With active encouragement from the Biden Treasury Department, the OECD in its Pillar 2 agreement failed to recognize our pioneering global minimum tax as a qualifying tax. Instead, the agreement they came back with is so inconsistent with our tax laws that it would tilt the playing field in favor of foreign firms. Now, it also destabilizes a network of constitutionally ratified bilateral tax treaties negotiated over the past half of a century. Now, for the first time, through under-taxed profit rules, or UTPRs, the Pillar 2 agreement authorizes foreign governments to tax income generated outside its border, including U.S. source income. Now, this is all based on an arbitrary set of rules approved by the OECD, foreign governments, and international accounting bureaucrats where the U.S. has minimal representation. Congress has absolutely no say. It also favors the tax incentives Europe likes, refundable tax credits, over the non-refundable business credits more common in the U.S. In this sense, it would constrain the ability of the U.S. Congress to write tax laws that promote growth and jobs, as Congress has done since the beginning of our republic. Now, this agreement is totally unacceptable, and it's no wonder that Biden administration sought to avoid consulting with Congress because they knew Congress would never approve it. OECD Pillar 1, intended to stop DSTs, is no better. Under Pillar 1, U.S. companies would pay far more than any other country and more than all of Europe. Now, that's right, the U.S. pays more than Europe. That is according to an analysis by a European Union think tank. Now, 60% of the revenue divided up under Pillar 1 agreement would come from U.S. firms. 60%. Our own Treasury Department acknowledges that about 50% of the firms are subject to Pillar 1 agreement would be U.S. companies. Republicans have repeatedly requested detailed analysis of how the agreement would impact American companies and workers, but Treasury has rejected those requests. All the while, foreign governments continue to collect DSTs from American companies. Now, given the economic stagnation in Europe since 2008, these DSTs should come as no surprise. The U.S. will continue to be a revenue target. Now, going into these OECD negotiations, Treasury should have recognized that governments in Europe would be looking for ways to rein in successful American companies and extract additional tax revenue to prop up their own poor domestic finances. As one author in Tax Notes put it, this effort has to be understood as a primarily European project and, in the larger picture, a way to sustain the euro. Biden administration has called for additional business taxes to fund their own domestic spending agenda. So why then would Treasury negotiate an OECD deal that surrenders over $120 billion, that's $120 billion in U.S. tax revenues to foreign countries? This makes absolutely no sense. Now, the OECD Global Tax Project is effectively controlled by Europe. Why? Because Europe controls 1/3 of the seats on the steering committee, and the broader inclusive framework includes over 30 tiny former European colonies. Members of this group include the Cook Islands, the Bahamas, St. Lucia, and the Samoa. The bottom line is the deck is stacked against America at the OECD. That is why it has never made sense for Treasury to negotiate behind closed doors with a group of 140 nations on a one country, one vote basis, when the U.S. accounts for 25% of global GDP and pays almost that percentage of dues at the OECD. I'm going to close with this. My whole life has been in the retail automobile business, and I've spent a lifetime negotiating. And it just doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that the U.S. has signed up for a bad deal. It's a bad deal for the American taxpayers. It's a bad deal for American workers. It's a bad deal for American businesses just trying to keep their doors open for the next generation of U.S. workers. I'm trying to figure, what are we trying to accomplish by doing something like this? I have never seen an instance where we are always so willing to give up market share and pick up the tab for other places that can't pay their own bills. It all falls on the American people. It is bizarre that we're even having to discuss this today, but we do. And I'd like to know, I'm not sure that I understand constitutionally that what the administration has done is even possible. There's a reason we're here. There's a reason why all of this starts in the House. There is no reason why Treasury has not sat down and talked with us about what they've done and failed to be able to answer any questions on it. So with that, I welcome Mr. Plowden. I want to thank you. You're giving up a day to come here and talk with us. And I think this is not a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. I said earlier, this is about jobs and companies and our ability to sustain market share globally. Why would the United States hamper itself to be successful? It makes no sense to me. Now, I'm pleased to recognize the gentleman from California, Ranking Member Mr. Thompson, for his opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Plowden, for being with us today. Mr. Chairman, our economic recovery from the pandemic has not only broken all of our own records, it's put us far and above the world's major economies. Despite naysayers and wishcasters betting against the American worker, we've been able to defy all odds. Thanks to President Biden and congressional Democrats investing in workers and families, over 13 million jobs have been added. Inflation has declined consecutively for the last 12 months, and we've had the strongest economic growth of all the world's major economies. And instead of building on this success, in the first tax subcommittee hearing of the 118th Congress, my colleagues are choosing to double down on their race to the bottom and protecting multinational corporations. From examining how we can extend the child tax credit to looking at how our tax code treats victims of disasters, there is much on the individual side for our committee to discuss, and I regret that my colleagues didn't want to start there. American workers and taxpayers have paid the price for a system that rewards large multinational corporations that do business in one country and then park their profits in the country with the lowest tax rate they can find. Republicans' desperate attempts to preserve this system is more of the same, sparing the largest, most profitable companies from paying their fair share while honest taxpayers are left with the bill. The global minimum tax is designed to level the playing field and put an end to underhanded profit shifting. For one, it brings parity to our small businesses, those who don't have the ability to move their profits offshore, who have already been paying their fair share. Second, it will encourage businesses to keep their incomes in the United States of America. There is widespread agreement around the world that the wealthiest corporations have an obligation to pay their fair share, and they won't wait for us to move forward in the process. More than 50 countries, large economies, are already implementing the global minimum tax. This is not the time to wish away reality, and the longer my colleagues take a head-in-the-sands approach, the more damage will be done to our taxpayers, our businesses, and our Treasury. While we've led the other large economies around the world in our recovery, our economy does not exist in isolation, and coordination will strengthen our commerce ties around the world. The truth is that abandoning these negotiations would be unambiguously worse for Americans and American businesses than continuing to negotiate and to ensure that we get the details right. Pulling out of this process puts other countries in charge of our fate and abandons American companies, American workers, and ultimately American taxpayers. Too much is at stake for our businesses and economy to let this train leave the station without American leadership and input. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Now I'd like to introduce the first panel for today's hearing. Michael Plowgen is the Deputy Secretary for International Tax Affairs at the Department of Treasury. Mr. Plowgen, I want to thank you for being here. You have 5 minutes to deliver your oral remarks, and thank you, sir, again for being here. We appreciate it.
Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Michael Plowgen, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Tax Affairs at the Department of the Treasury's Office of Tax Policy.
Is your mic on?
I think so.
Yeah.
Maybe get a little closer.
Need to, okay,
There you go.
thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the Ways and Means Tax Subcommittee regarding U.S. engagement on the two-pillar solution in the G20 OECD Inclusive Framework on BEPS. I would like to begin by placing the work that we are doing on the two-pillar solution, and particularly on Pillar 2, in context. The two-pillar solution grew out of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development project known as BEPS, for base erosion and profit shifting. The BEPS project began in 2012 at the request of the Group of 20, who were concerned about the ability of multinational corporations to avoid tax by shifting profits into low or no tax jurisdictions. Since the BEPS project began over a decade ago, the United States has had a strong interest in its success. The active participation of the executive branch and the support of Congress has been crucial in protecting our tax base from being eroded by multinational businesses. Prior to our engagement in BEPS, multinationals' ability to shift paper profits to low tax jurisdictions resulted in an unproductive race to the bottom in corporate tax rates. Unilateral attempts to address this problem led to uncertainty and instability for both U.S. taxpayers and the U.S. government. The BEPS project led countries to enact changes to international tax rules to limit profit shifting. In the United States, the BEPS project provided the foundation for several Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions, including the Global Intangible Low Tax Income or GILTI provisions, the interest deduction limitation, and the anti-hybrids provisions. However, starting in 2018, it became clear that further work was needed to stabilize the international tax system and enable U.S. businesses to compete on a level tax playing field. That work has continued across multiple Congresses and administrations. As part of that process, this administration has pushed to reach a global framework on a two-pillar solution to reform the international tax system. Pillar 1, when implemented, will get rid of the unilateral and discriminatory digital services taxes that largely impact U.S. businesses and will reallocate a portion of taxing rights to reflect the way business is done in the 21st century. Pillar 2 will level the playing field between U.S. and foreign businesses and end the race to the bottom in corporate tax rates by establishing a global minimum tax on the earnings of large multinationals, regardless of where they are headquartered or where they operate. It will ensure the United States can tax U.S. multinationals at reasonable levels without being undercut by other countries using their tax systems to induce our multinationals to shift their profits, operations, or residency offshore. Over the past 2 years, the administration has engaged in the Inclusive Framework to work through the details of this package. The Inclusive Framework has reached consensus on model rules on Pillar 2, and many countries are implementing those model rules. Continued U.S. engagement in the Inclusive Framework is essential to ensure consistent interpretation of those rules. Discussions in the Inclusive Framework have resulted in additional guidance, including guidance issued this week that would treat transferable credits appropriately as equivalent to refundable credits. Treasury negotiators have also been working in the Inclusive Framework to develop a complete Pillar 1 agreement, though there are still important elements of Pillar 1 that remain open. The executive branch and congressional partnership on international tax is a long-standing, important relationship with a shared goal of protecting U.S. taxpayer interests and providing certainty and stability in the international tax system. It goes without saying that Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 can only be implemented in the U.S. with the support of Congress. We hope to have a complete Pillar 1 package soon and intend to continue to seek input. Similarly, with respect to Pillar 2, we stand ready to work with Congress to enact the reforms proposed in the President's budget to implement Pillar 2, which would increase U.S. revenue and strengthen our tax system. We will also continue to work with Congress to prioritize issues for interpretive guidance. As always, we would like to offer our technical assistance to any relevant legislative effort. And with that, I would be pleased to respond to any questions.
Mr. Plowton, Mrs. Gordon, in the concluding paragraph of her testimony, raises the analogy of the USMCA to the current situation Congress finds itself in. Now, my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, may recall the Trump administration on that trade agreement took the same position as this administration in taking on Pillar 2. That is, the deal was negotiated, and Congress should consider the deal signed, sealed, and delivered. As members will recall, that agreement was reopened and renegotiated largely at the direction of my Democrat friends in this committee. Now, Mr. Plowton, in your testimony, you state the administration wants to work with Congress to take Pillar 2 process to conclusion. I appreciate the constructive tone, but substantively, if you want this agreement to become domestic law, as you just stated in your statement, are you willing to go back to the negotiating table and take care of the issues of importance to members of this committee?
Thank you, Chairman. So only Congress has the authority to implement or not implement changes to U.S. law. That is true with respect to Pillar 2. It's true with respect to Pillar 1. We have received a lot of input from Congress, from the tax writing committees, as well as from U.S. businesses and other stakeholders. We take that input very seriously. We take that into the negotiations, and we would like to continue to work with Congress to take that input and take that into the discussions.
Well, you know, I appreciate your tone, because we went through the same thing with the USMCA. My question is, if there's this willingness to work through the Congress, why is the Congress denied information when they try to find out what exactly was negotiated, how it was negotiated, and why we considered it a done deal? Now, I would like to see this go back. I think members of this panel, not panel, but us up here, including both sides of the aisle, should be more involved with this. I don't like it, whether it was the Trump administration or the Biden administration foregoing and going around taking an end run on Congress. There's a reason for that structure to be in place, and I'd like to see it taken care of. So I'm going to yield now to my friend from California, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Plowden, thank you again for being here. You mentioned in your testimony that the changes you've been able to secure thanks to congressional input. Could you provide more details on the issues that Treasury has negotiated that will benefit the United States?
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson. Yes, happy to. Protecting U.S. interests has been a consistent priority for the multiple administrations that have been involved in these negotiations, and the Pillar 2 model rules and interpretive guidance reflect that. I can't speak to every decision that's been made, but a few examples I think will paint the picture. Many important U.S. provisions, including accelerated depreciation, are specifically identified in the model rules as book tax differences that do not give rise to adjustments to the effective tax rate and do not give rise to top-up tax under Pillar 2. Treasury negotiators have also been able to secure a GILTI coordination rule that reduces the burden for U.S. businesses in allocating taxes paid under GILTI for purposes of Pillar 2. On Monday, there was also guidance that was released that provides for a safe harbor on the UTPR that provides temporary taxpayer relief and time to resolve outstanding issues in the application of the UTPR to parent jurisdictions. I also want to highlight the guidance on the treatment of credits. So credits through tax equity partnerships structures that are commonly used in the low-income housing tax credit context, as well as for certain green energy credits, have also been protected under administrative guidance. Monday's guidance also, as I mentioned, protects the value of transferable credits like those enacted under the Inflation Reduction Act by treating them appropriately as refundable tax credits. And I think that administrative guidance really demonstrates that the U.S. should remain at the table as the world moves forward and implements Pillar 2.
Thank you. I think the transferable credits provision speaks loudly about the importance of us being at that table. I appreciate that. It seems to me that your recent accomplishments are proof of the importance of remaining at that table. One thing's really clear to me, and that's that the OECD is going to forge ahead. And the United States can't just put our head in the sand and pretend that it isn't, as some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to think that we should be doing. So I'm glad that notwithstanding some resistance from my colleagues on the other side, the Biden administration, Secretary Yellen, and you have been steadfast in your commitment to representing the United States at the OECD. Appreciate that, and I want you to know that you have the full support of folks on my side of the aisle. A lot's been said about the JCT revenue estimates. It seems to me that estimating the revenue effects of adopting or not adopting Pillar 2 is an extremely difficult exercise, even for the most qualified economists at JCT. In your opinion, what should we take away from these estimates that we've seen?
Well, I think that's a really important issue, and I think there are several things to keep in mind when reviewing the JCT revenue estimates. First is the modified baseline that JCT uses. The JCT analysis says that if the 40-plus jurisdictions that have announced plans to implement Pillar 2 do in fact adopt Pillar 2, and the U.S. does nothing, then the impact of Pillar 2 on U.S. revenues could vary by $400 billion, depending on their assumptions on profit shifting. If you just look at the midpoint of that range, what they're saying is that Pillar 2 adoption by those 40-plus jurisdictions and no action by the U.S. Is an increase in U.S. tax receipts of $25 billion. In addition, I think it's important to note that in every scenario that the JCT analyzed, U.S. adoption of Pillar 2 increases U.S. tax receipts as compared to inaction by the U.S. For instance, scenario 5, which shows U.S. adoption of Pillar 2 and adoption by those 40 baseline countries, would increase U.S. revenue by $236.5 billion. So overall, the takeaway is if other major members of the global economy are moving ahead, and they are moving ahead to implement Pillar 2, it's better from a revenue perspective for the U.S. to take action than to remain on the sidelines.
Thank you very much. You'll back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Swiker from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is the proper term Deputy Secretary?
Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Deputy Assistant. That gets a little long, doesn't it?
It does.
Forgive me for, because I think you actually have one of the most fascinating jobs someone could have if you're a tax geek. But I think actually one of the things you just said was a little duplicitous, so forgive me for being cruel. So we're here 2 years from now, after what you're calling the victory has functionally timed out. What's the effect 24 months or 36 months from now then compared to today? Not what our friends across the other parts of the world on tax receipts. What's good for America?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, the JCT analysis shows
No, stop, Mr. What you said is the JCT analysis, if we did nothing. I'm just asking, ceteris paribus, then till 36 months from now. Do we have more tax receipts or less?
I'm sorry, what's the hypothetical? If the U.S. does nothing?
Today, 3 years from now.
3 years from now.
It's not hard.
And the U.S. does what?
Nothing. No. Just from today's tax receipts
Right.
to this new scheme, as we'll call it, what happens to U.S. tax receipts? Are they up or down?
The JCT analysis
The
shows
JCT analysis was based on the concept that if we did nothing and our trading partners did something. I'm just asking, are we up or down?
The JCT analysis does not answer that question. It shows
Actually, it
a
alludes
range.
to it.
I'm sorry?
So please go on.
It does not answer that question. It shows a range, a variable range of $400 billion. Again, the midpoint of that range is an increase in U.S. tax receipts of $25 billion.
Really? Because we whiteboarded this last night, and we actually had just the opposite. That once we got beyond the 2-year reprieve that it seems so joyful, we actually had the U.S. Receipts going down. Why do you believe we see the difference? I'm not asking for you to talk about JCT. You have smart people over with Treasury. What are you seeing?
I'm not an estimator. The Treasury estimators have estimated the effects of enacting the president's budget proposals, which would enact Pillar 2, and those raise considerable revenue for the U.S.
Okay, so we agree to this, and that's with the 2 years, and even with what you've also done in regards to R&D tax credits and how that amortization is treated, and you actually see receipts going up. And do you think that's what the next panel is going to tell us?
I don't know what the next panel is going to tell you.
So you haven't read any of their testimony?
I have not.
Really? I'm glad for the level of professionalism we're dealing with. You're making our job more difficult, because for many of us, we're trying to just defend, are we taking in receipts? Does this increase U.S. economics and opportunity and jobs? Or are we basically giving it away? Because we have other analysts coming to us and saying, this is not actually good for the robustness of an American economy. Okay, in the last minute we have here or so, walk me through what's happening on R&D credits.
So with respect to R&D credits, this is an issue that we've heard quite a bit of input from Congress and from U.S. businesses and other stakeholders on. It is an issue that we have raised in negotiations.
What's happening with them?
By what's happening with them, you mean how are they treated under Pillar 2?
How are they being treated, and how does it affect U.S. Economic expansion?
Yeah, so U.S. R&D credits generally are non-refundable. There's a small portion that is refundable, but typically for taxpayers who are within scope of Pillar 2, they would be non-refundable. That would reduce the effective tax rate. It would be treated as a reduction in taxes.
And therefore, it would be subject to?
It would depend on the effective tax rate of the taxpayer. So it would reduce the effective tax rate of the taxpayer.
And so therefore be subjected to the functionally the OECD sanction?
It could be. It could be
could be,
the
or-
taxpayer could be subject to top-up tax, depending on the effective tax rate of the taxpayer.
Mr. Chairman, sorry it took so long to get there, but something we all claim we sort of agree upon is now somewhat put at risk on how it's being modeled, particularly in the tax rate. So with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, are you going to point out that the witness's testimony has been embargoed?
No, I'm glad you pointed it out. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, and also Mr. Ploughton, if you could you get a little closer to the mic so it comes across a little bit louder, okay?
I will try.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Mr.
Chairman.
Doggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since first joining this Ways and Means Committee more than 20 years ago, one of my top priorities has been shutting down abusive offshore tax havens. And all that time, Republicans have been doing all that they can to protect that tax evasion. Back in 2001, then Republican leader Dick Armey was castigating the OECD in almost the very same words we have just heard today. They favor allowing the biggest corporations to dodge their responsibility to fairly contribute to our national security and other vital public services. When these profitable multinationals can shift profits they've earned designing new products right here in America, profits they've earned selling to American consumers, and move that into tax havens, we all lose. Small businesses and other domestic businesses, like a car dealer, cannot secret their earnings in some offshore tax haven. International tax dodging shifts more of the tax burden to those businesses like that and to working Americans, to a nurse, to a firefighter, to a teacher, many of whom end up paying a greater proportion of their earnings into our Treasury than the largest, most profitable multinationals in the world. The Joint Committee on Taxation looked at the facts, at the effect of the 2017 Trump Republican tax scam, what impact it had on the 88 largest American multinationals. Before their scam was enacted, those 88 multinationals averaged of only 16%. After the tax scam, their rate was cut to 7.8%. certainly a rate any police officer would be delighted to pay, but is unable to do so. Now we can understand why Republicans are working so hard to shield these profitable companies from a 15% tax minimum. Last year, U.S. multinationals booked $325 billion in profits in the top 7 offshore tax havens. This contrasts with their reporting only $50 billion in 7 of the world's largest economies where they were doing business. IRS data shows that American firms reported far more earnings in the Cayman Islands, population 65,000, than they did in China and Canada combined. Indeed, American multinationals reported $60 billion in profits in the Cayman Islands in 2019. This, of course, is impossible since the total economic output of the Cayman Islands is only $6 billion. Just think about that. $60 billion on which they paid an effective rate of 0.6%. This is a fraud on the American people, pure and simple, and those that defend it are aiding and abetting that fraud. Thankfully, because of the leadership of Secretary Yellen, the Biden administration has been a leader. They have led the world more than 140 countries in what even the Wall Street Journal has reported as the most important tax deal to be agreed upon by such a large group of countries within a century. In none of the top 10 countries where U.S. multinationals employ workers are they paying less than a 20% tax rate. And in none of the 10 countries where they book their profits do they pay more than 7%, with rates going down to the 0.6% in the Caymans. Mr. Plowgen, what is required to stop this outrage and this fraud on small businesses and individual American taxpayers?
One straightforward way to address the issue of profit shifting by multinationals would be to reform our GILTI rules so that they apply on a country-by-country basis. The current law GILTI applies on a globally blended basis, which means that foreign tax credits for taxes paid in high-tax jurisdictions shield the profits in low-tax jurisdictions.
And how would other countries increasing their taxes to make these multinationals pay at least 15% minimum tax, how would that actually make America more competitive?
Yeah, it makes America more competitive in multiple ways. It allows the U.S. to maintain a robust corporate tax system because it prevents the shifting of profits offshore and allows the U.S. to tax multinationals at reasonable rates.
And to compete based on our education system, our workforce, our justice system, our national security. Thank you so much for your service and your testimony.
Thank the gentleman. Now I'm recognizing Mr. Arrington from Texas. And we're going to go in accordance with committee practice. We are going to go on a 2-to-1 questioning. Mr. Arrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Plowgen, you just said that American companies will be more competitive if we tax them at a higher rate. We're at a 12% global minimum tax, and you think it's going to make American companies more competitive to levy more taxes. Taxes, by the way, corporate taxes that are passed through in higher cost of goods and services to consumers, which will exacerbate inflation, will also impact wages by reducing wages and income. So tell me again how America is more competitive if we increase taxes on American companies. Just kind of taking off where you all left off in the last Q&A.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Thank you. So Pillar 2 levels the playing field for U.S. multinationals, which were up to this point, the only multinationals that face a minimum tax on their foreign earnings. Pillar 2 ensures that all multinationals, wherever they're headquartered, wherever they operate, are subject to a minimum level of tax.
Shouldn't other sovereign nation states decide what their tax system should be and what their international tax policy should be? Why do we need this one world order of tax regime? Well, let me ask you a more direct question. You had Democrat control of the Senate, Democrat control of the House in last Congress, and a Democrat president. did you increase the global minimum tax from 12 to 15%? In the Democrat, all Democrat, total partisan Democrat tax policy that is the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, did you raise the global minimum tax?
Changes consistent with Pillar 2 were passed in the House.
Did you
and they
raise the
were
tax
close to
rate
being
from
passed.
12 to 15? It's a simple question.
And they were close to being passed
Did
in
it
the
pass
Senate.
from 12 to 15? Yes or no?
But one of the concerns that was raised
See,
was
just
that other
listen,
countries...
if I may reclaim my time, you won't answer the question. It's a simple question. And if the American people were sitting here wondering why in the world we would allow our companies to be less competitive in the global market, and why we would cede our sovereignty in terms of tax policy to other countries, along with our tax base. What you're doing is a backdoor coercive strategy to force Congress to have to raise taxes from the 12% global minimum tax to the 15%. If we don't, here's what you're setting up. Here's what the Biden administration is setting up. Other countries will tax not just U.S. operations in their jurisdiction, they will tax U.S. companies. They will take our revenue to support their policies, their programs, their people, without any say. Without any say in the matter. Well, I guess they did have a say. They rejected the global minimum tax increase. They rejected it even with Democrat control. And in addition to other countries, this is the setup, this is the backdoor scheme. They not only take the taxes from this country, and JCT says in one estimate $56 billion. $56 billion. Are you going to tax more to offset that loss? President Biden's budget includes almost $5 trillion of new taxes. So we're going to tax the American people more? I think the most outrageous aspect of this whole thing, not to mention the fact that we have pleaded with you all to consult with Congress and we got nothing, no response, is the fact that the tax base will be ceded to foreign jurisdictions for their people, their programs, and their policies that we will subsidize, that United States hardworking taxpayers will subsidize, but we will also undermine our sovereignty. We have set policy, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, we've set policies. Whether I agree with them or not, they're the law of the land, and they're tax policies to incentivize behavior, like we want to encourage investment in R&D, or the work opportunity tax credit. That's it. So if a company takes their liability lower than 15% because they're taking advantage of the work opportunity tax credit to help veterans, to help people on food stamps and other public assistance to get jobs, they're penalized for that because of the top-up tax. This thing is completely off the rails and upside down. It's absurd, and it's demeaning to the tax policy subcommittee that you didn't even respond to our request for consultation. I apologize. Thanks for the indulgence.
No, that's okay. That's okay. You're deserving of the indulgence. Thank you, Mr. Arrington. Now, gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Ferguson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Plowden, I'll start with a simple question. Why do you think that you and your colleagues in the administration are so gifted and talented that you can override the Constitution and write tax policy and usurp our authority there?
I do not think that.
Well, good, then you should stop doing it. Tax policy belongs with this committee of jurisdiction, not a rogue administration running out and cutting deals with foreign countries that make America less competitive. This whole notion that somehow or another we need to be in bed with the same tax rate as the rest of the world is absolute lunacy. It is lunacy. Our mission, our goal every single day should be defending those things that make America great and making sure that we're the most competitive place in the world to invent, innovate, manufacture, and sell around the globe. Americans today really care about their jobs and being able to provide for their families. Americans today care about being able to afford a decent, safe place to live. Americans today really care about their kids' education, and most importantly, they care about their freedoms deeply. And our entire philosophy should be around preserving those four things, not putting us on par with a bunch of other countries that don't share our values or our competitive nature. Why in the world would you allow countries with higher and more generous R&D credits have an advantage over Americans? Why would you do that?
Congressman, we share your concerns about making sure that America remains a competitive place to do business. In fact, we think it's the best place in the world to do business. Pillar 2 is about leveling the playing field for U.S. businesses. Again, Pillar 2...
Leveling the playing field for U.S. businesses, wait a minute. We're about the American people, the American workers, and American businesses and innovators and creators. We are not about leveling the playing field with the rest of the country. We're about being number one day in and day out. This whole business of leveling the playing field is it is a farce. We're either going to be number one in the world or we're not. I don't want to be number one tied with 5 other countries or 20 other countries. We need to be number one. We need to be doing things that increases productivity, that allows Americans to have better jobs. We need to be doing things that allow Americans to live in decent, safe housing. We need to be doing things that make sure that our children are educated in a way that they can compete on the global stage, and we need to be defending our freedoms. The only way that we can do that is to have a vibrant, strong economy, and we should be drawing treasure from around the world, not sending our treasure across our borders. How in the world can you justify sending American tax dollars to foreign jurisdictions? How can you justify France being able to tax a U.S. company? That is absolutely crazy. We have real problems. We have real challenges in making sure that we can meet the needs of the American people, and all of a sudden you're going to suck billions of dollars of taxes out of the U.S. economy and send it to people that don't necessarily share our values. Why in the world would you do that?
I share your concerns.
I don't care if you share them or not. I don't care if you like them or not. I'm asking you, why would you do it?
We believe that on a level playing field, American businesses and American workers will win. We believe that when there's a level tax playing field, U.S. businesses will be able to compete and win.
Wait, stop right there, sir. Let me reclaim my time. How is, again, I don't think this is leveling the playing field. I think this puts us behind the 8 ball. And here's why. If all of a sudden, here in America, if we're sending our tax dollars overseas, and our spending continues to go up because we've got some real challenges with the population, if we can continue to go down that road, then we're going to have to tax our traditional taxpayers more. It's going to put more of a burden on our job creators and our American workers. As that happens, our productivity goes down, our ability to invest in new technologies, and training goes down. We don't have the resources to take care of our most vulnerable. The only way you can do it is to raise taxes. As you raise taxes, that makes us less competitive. I do not see the logic. I do not understand how in the world that you can go through the mental gymnastics, or you or anybody else in the administration, to land where you have. If you are taking revenue out of the U.S. and delivering it to other countries, then how does that help us meet the needs of the American people?
Pillar 2 reduces the incentive to shift profits offshore, and it allows the U.S. to maintain a robust corporate tax system.
But you didn't really care about that a couple of years ago. You didn't really fight for guilty. Matter of fact, you kind of delayed everything, put us behind the 8 ball. I would ask you to do this. Think about the things that American families wake up and think about every day. A job, a house, an education for their kids, safety and security, and think about the freedoms that we have. And ask yourself, does this policy advance those goals or not? And the answer is no. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Plowgen, thank you, and I hope you get to speak now. We've heard a lot of speeches. I didn't think we were going back to isolationism, but apparently that's the new road that we're setting out on, is that we're going to stand isolated and alone. Also, just for the record, you know, about the Democratic majorities, they have this body called the Senate. They have something called the cloture vote. I'm sure all of you are aware of that, where it takes 60 votes. Where in the Constitution does it say you need 60 votes to pass a bill? But Mitch McConnell swears by that that's exactly what is needed for things to happen and transpire. The House of Representatives should wake up. More than 500 of our bills, Democrat and Republican and nonpartisan, don't get taken up in the United States Senate. I wish the press would write about that, because of the cloture vote. So let's have that for the record. Now, Mr. Plowgen, apparently in the age of isolationism, apparently the United States exists alone in a global economy. And these other 50 countries, as been articulated by Mr. Thompson and was also articulated by Mr. Doggett, are they simply going to, if nothing happens, if the United States doesn't approve this, does this just simply, Pillar 2, just simply go away?
No, Congressman, that's not what would happen. There are jurisdictions that have already implemented Pillar 2, South Korea and Japan being two of those, and all EU member states.
South Korea and Japan, are they pretty active economies?
They are.
Oh, all right. And so South Korea and Japan, what other economic impacts would that mean?
Well,
Because we want to be isolationists, right?
Right. All EU member states are also obligated to implement Pillar 2, and most have legislation at this point. And there are many of our other major trading partners, the UK, Canada, Australia, that are moving forward.
UK, well. Canada, Australia. Boy, those sound like awful partners for us. So do you really, don't you think we ought to isolate from them? And no?
I don't think so, Congressman. I think we need to be at the negotiating table in order to represent U.S. interests in these discussions. And as you know, the administration has proposed reforms to implement Pillar 2 in the United States as well.
And you kept on talking about a level playing field and allowing the U.S. to compete. How is that to our advantage, especially given this great nation of ours and our ability, as is demonstrated in the global economy, to compete?
Absolutely. So up to now, U.S. multinationals have been the only multinationals that are subject to a minimum tax on their foreign earnings. Now, under Pillar 2, all multinationals, wherever they're headquartered, wherever they operate.
So previously it was
subject.
only U.S. internationals, and now everyone is subject to that. That seems like it's leveling the playing field to me.
It does, and we believe that U.S. businesses will be able to compete and win in that environment. It also levels the playing field for small businesses and purely domestic firms who cannot shift their profits offshore to avoid paying tax, and so they can compete better.
And why is that important?
That's important because they also need to be able to compete and grow our economy. Small businesses are major employers in the U.S., and that benefits American workers.
So it's the small businessman that really is going to be advantaged as much as the large multinational is going to be advantaged through competition as well, because it'll be the first time that the other global multinationals will be subject to the same tax. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's why the administration is pursuing this policy for business in general, to level the playing field and allow the United States to compete and succeed and to grow jobs and grow this economy.
That's exactly right.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Smith.
Let me begin by thanking Chairman Kelly for allowing me here and for your leadership. We are incredibly grateful that you are at the realm of this committee with your experience, your knowledge, and your passion. And glad to have you leading our tax writing committee. Mr. Plowgen, no one in the Biden administration has the power to write U.S. tax policy. The Supreme Court has said that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. It is among the most solemn responsibilities of government. And under the Constitution, it is strictly controlled. The power to tax demands the highest level of accountability to the American people, especially when masses of jobs are at risk. And while every member seated here today is accountable to voters, you and Secretary Yellen are not. I have 8 specific questions on Treasury's engagement with the tax writing committees over the OECD negotiations, and I ask that you please just answer yes or no. Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing to a UTPR surtax that would allow foreign governments to tax the U.S. operations of U.S. companies?
We did receive input from Congress on the UTPR during the
So that's a yes?
negotiations.
That's a yes?
We did receive input from Congress, yes.
Okay, I have followed this issue very closely over the past 3 years, and I don't think that's the case. I know that Treasury has never consulted with Republican members prior to a decision. And unless you would like to revise your testimony, please provide to this committee in writing the date of the consultation, the names of Treasury personnel involved, and the names of members of Congress that Treasury met with. Can you get me that information?
We get input from Congress in many different ways, from
Can you
hearings,
give me that information?
from letters, from consultation with staff as well.
Yes or no? Can you provide this committee that information?
I do not have that information currently.
So how do you know what you just testified before Congress is accurate?
We receive input from Congress in multiple ways. As I said, through
What are those
hearings-
multiple ways and from what members?
Through hearings, through letters from Congress.
What
from
hearing?
members. The Treasury is called before House Ways and Means. The Secretary Yellen has testified before Ways and Means. We've
Testified
received-
after she made the negotiations in regards to it.
We receive letters from members as well.
Let me ask you another question. Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury accepting this recent offer by foreign countries to delay the UTPR surtax by just 1 year?
Again, we received input from Congress and from taxpayers with concerns.
You did not consult with the chairman of the tax writing committee, so who did you consult with?
We received input from the tax writing committees on the UTPR and concerns about.
No one from our committee on the Republican side. So was it only the Democrat side you spoke with?
We speak with staff of the tax writing committee on a bipartisan basis on a regular basis.
Did you, in regards to this delay for 1 year, did you speak to the majority in the tax writing committee of Ways and Means?
We received input on concerns about the UTPR and concerns about application of the UTPR to parent jurisdictions, especially in the early years of.
You received letters from us,
the two.
but did you consult with us before this decision? Yes or no?
We speak with the tax writing committees on a regular basis.
Well, I'm the
Received
chairman
that
of this
input.
committee, and it's almost crickets. So you might want to do a little bit better in regards to that. Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing that the U.S. R&D credit would be disadvantaged versus the R&D credits of other countries like the UK?
I cannot speak to that decision. That decision, this has been an ongoing process for multiple years, and that is a long-standing distinction in the Pillar 2 rules.
Yeah, it's pretty detrimental to U.S. businesses. Were you part of the negotiation?
I rejoined Treasury in October of 2021. The Pillar 2 negotiations have been going on since 2018.
So since 2021, when you were in the negotiations, R&D hasn't been discussed around you?
We have raised the R&D credit as an important issue in the negotiations.
Did anyone in Congress sign off on the decision to give generous, refundable corporate tax credits and Chinese state subsidies an advantage over more typical tax incentives like those enacted by Congress on a bipartisan basis? Yes or no?
Again, I was not part of the negotiations when that decision was made. That's been an issue in the Pillar 2 negotiations that's longstanding.
Can you find that answer out for me?
I will check on that and come back to you.
I would love that to be submitted. Did Treasury consult with Congress prior to Treasury conceding that the U.S. GILTI rule would not receive full grandfathering status as the only global minimum tax in the world? Yes or no?
I was not part of the negotiations at that juncture.
So once again, can you provide me the answer to that question with whoever at Treasury that was?
I will check on that.
Did anyone in Congress sign off on Treasury's decision to surrender U.S. tax revenues from GILTI and Subpart F because of the OECD's preference for local corporate minimum taxes?
You're speaking about the qualified domestic minimum taxes. So we, again, received input on that. The qualified domestic minimum taxes are consistent with all international tax rules that provide the primary taxing right to a jurisdiction when it taxes its residents on income that arises
I understand
in
what
that
it is, but my
jurisdiction.
question was, did anyone in Congress sign off on Treasury's decision?
Again, we receive input from Congress in many ways.
Once again, I ask, unless you would like to revise your testimony, please provide to the committee in writing the date of the consultation with the members of Congress, the names of Treasury personnel involved, and the names of members of Congress that Treasury met with. Did anyone in Congress sign off on the decision for a 15% global minimum tax rate to replace the 12 to 13% rate that the OECD was considering prior to President Biden taking office?
I was not part of the negotiations at that stage.
Can you get that information for the committee?
I will check on that.
Was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing on the scope of the Pillar 1 profit allocation, which skews heavily against U.S. companies while exempting their foreign headquartered competitors?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Was Congress, once again, was Congress consulted prior to Treasury agreeing on the scope of the Pillar 1 profit allocation, which skews heavily against U.S. companies while exempting their foreign headquartered competitors?
I don't think that it exempts foreign MNEs under Pillar 1, so I'm not sure I understand the
From my understanding, it does. So would you be opposed to it if it did not exempt those foreign headquartered competitors?
Sorry,
Would Treasury be opposed to it?
I don't think that it does exempt foreign headquartered multinationals in Pillar 1.
So in regards to Pillar 1 profit allocation period, did Treasury consult with any members of Congress?
We continue to consult with Congress about Pillar 1. Pillar 1 remains open. There are many open issues on Pillar 1.
So it goes back to my simple question. You said, yes, you have. I would love for you all to provide in writing to this committee who you consulted with, what members of Treasury that consulted with us, and what date. If Treasury had consulted with Congress, we would have avoided the multitude of Biden administration losses in the OECD negotiations. My final question: most observers are skeptical that China will ever truly comply with this OECD agreement. Secretary Yellen recently traveled to China to meet with the Chinese Communist Party officials. During that trip, was she able to obtain commitments from China that it would adopt the OECD agreement and implement it fairly?
Secretary Yellen did meet with her Chinese counterparts, and in an attempt to reset the relationship with China, I do not know whether they spoke about Pillar 2, but the UTPR is an important part of Pillar 2 that ensures that China and other jurisdictions do not gain an advantage if they do not adopt Pillar 2. And that's why the UTPR is an important part of Pillar 2. It provides an enforcement mechanism that ensures that Chinese multinationals will be subject to the same minimum tax as other multinationals.
We know China's really not that great of following rules and agreements. We've seen that with our country. That's why I was hopeful that the Treasury Secretary, in her long visit to China, would definitely have talked to them about whether they would adopt OECD and the agreement and implement it fairly. Since it's so important, I figured that would be top of her list. Whether by manipulating financial statements or by creating new state subsidies, China will find ways to evade these OECD rules and allowing CCP-supported companies to gain a competitive advantage against the United States is yet another failure in these negotiations by the Biden administration. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I now recognize Mr. Hearn from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important meeting. Mr. Plowden, I'm going to piggyback a little bit off what the chairman had to talk about, but I'm glad to hear you've been here for a year and a half, so we know we're talking to the person that would have the answers. So I appreciate the chairman asking you for resolve in the conversations that you've specifically had or your team has had with Congress, or with Ways and Means, specifically the tax writings committee that you're speaking to today. You mentioned that the chairman mentioned about responding in writing. In November of last year, Ranking Member Brady and I wrote a letter together asking you for modeling data and estimates on how U.S. companies and federal tax revenue would be impacted by the OECD Pillar 1 agreement. And how does the Treasury plan to achieve ratification of an MLC by December 31st without sharing essential information with the Congress that has not been involved in the Treasury's unilateral negotiations? I know you say you've talked about this. I mean, the response to the November letter by myself and Ranking Member Brady, and then again from myself solely in March of this year, I mean, the responses could be, what do you want for Christmas? They were not responding to the letters at all. So I'm not sure who is writing you letters. I find it hard to believe, until you prove us all differently, that you've been dialoguing with the committee that has jurisdiction over this in Congress. I'm asking again, please share these projections with the Ways and Means Committee, and will you commit to sharing this information? I'll be nice, but there wasn't a time frame put on it, but within 30 days. That's not too much to ask.
Well, Congressman, first of all, I want to say that Pillar 1 cannot be approved without congressional support.
We're keenly aware of that, but I'm just asking, why couldn't you respond to the letters in November and March of this year?
There are open issues that I mentioned in the Pillar 1 discussions, and specifically those open issues, as mentioned in the outcome statement last week that was issued by the Inclusive Framework, relate to issues that have to do with the economics of Pillar 1. And specifically issues around how the Pillar 1 taxing right is coordinated with the existing international tax system. So, for example, there are issues around how much should existing taxes offset the Pillar 1 taxing right. There are questions about how withholding taxes imposed by jurisdictions should be treated. There are questions about what is the threshold for residual profits on which the Pillar 1 taxing right should be made. And so the Pillar 1 agreement is not complete, and we are concerned that providing estimates would not provide Congress with a complete picture of the Pillar 1 negotiations.
So, Mr. Plowden, again, following up on what the chairman said about China, and actually I asked Secretary Yellen this specifically sitting in your seat when she was here last. What assurances do we have that China is going to follow these model rules to do the things that you're talking about as you related to the UTPR? What are the punishment? Secretary Yellen went to China and said the world is big enough for both of us to play in a level playing field. Do we honestly believe, based on all relationship right now with China, that they're going to play by the rules when their whole mission in life, as stated by the president of their country, the general secretary of the Communist Chinese people, has said time and time again that their goal in life is to become the #1 nation in the world, both economically and militarily? do we honestly think that their goal in life is to be on a level playing field with us?
Well, we know, Congressman, as you suggest, that China does often try to undermine or circumvent international institutions, international partnerships and agreements, and we go into negotiations with our eyes open about that.
So we don't have any way to be punitive to that. I just want to say a couple last things here, and then I will yield back. You know, the EU Tax Observatory released an EU-funded report this month that goes into detail on the country-by-country breakdown of covered groups and their Amount A profits. Treasury's argument that any release of impact analysis or modeling data would undermine current negotiation is a facade and is not sufficient for the tax writers on this committee. Do you have a better reason for not complying with my request? You just alluded to the fact that there was incomplete, but you didn't share it quite like that. Do you have any way of fulfilling my request?
Once again, there are open issues in the Pillar 1 negotiations. Once we can resolve those issues, we plan to share estimates with Congress.
And you will follow up in writing to the questions that we asked in those letters, both Kevin Brady and myself, and then again me. I would really appreciate those in writing. As the chairman said, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Hearn. Now we recognize the gentlelady from California, Mrs. Sanchez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, Republicans are once again demonstrating their unfailing commitment to shielding large corporations from paying their fair share in taxes. Rather than working towards real solutions, Republicans want to let massive multinational corporations move their profits to no tax or low tax jurisdiction so that they can avoid paying their fair share. And rather than working towards real solutions, Republicans are willing to put nearly 9 million U.S. workers out of a job. In contrast, Democrats recognize that we must remove profit-shifting incentives from our international tax system. We support the Biden administration's work to protect domestic tax incentives. Those incentives include many of the Inflation Reduction Act's green tax credits that represent the largest single climate investment in American history. Protecting those green energy tax incentives would deliver lower costs for working families and take a huge step in the right direction in protecting our planet. And anybody who doubts that we are in dire need to protect our planet only has to look to the extreme heat that we are currently experiencing to understand what exactly is at stake. I want to focus on a crucial part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which are the transferable tax credits. Firms that don't have the tax capacity to claim non-refundable credits can still benefit from the IRA's transferable credits, spurring green energy development. The OECD guidance released on Monday was certainly favorable on the transferable credits issue. This is going to help protect billions of dollars that Democrats invested in clean manufacturing, for instance. Assistant Secretary Plugin, thank you for being here. Despite the way that you've been badgered a bit, you're answering, I think, as honestly as you can. And I just want to say, I assume that the favorable guidance on the transferable credits wasn't a result of your staying home and watching reruns of The Golden Girls. So I want to thank you for your service, and I want to thank you for taking multiple trips across the Atlantic to advocate on behalf of the United States in these negotiations. I think it's important for the committee to get a sense of the type of work that goes into your advocacy here on behalf of the United States. Can you describe some of the opposition that you faced, and how did the United States' persistence at the negotiating table pay off?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So this was an issue on which we received a lot of input from Congress and from U.S. businesses about the importance of these credits and their treatment under Pillar 2. As you suggest, approximately 9 months ago, many countries opposed treating transferable credits as refundable. There were a few allies early on who were very important to building momentum, but the majority view was deep skepticism of this position. The process of changing the view in the room is really a multi-pronged one. So Secretary Yellen spent time with her counterparts explaining the importance of these credits economically. and from a climate perspective as well. International affairs engaged with their counterparts in other countries. The rest of the administration engaged as well. I certainly spent time with the lead tax negotiators from key jurisdictions, building support. And then my team, and I just cannot say enough good things about my team. They have been amazing and tireless through this whole process. They have to convince negotiators that our position is the right policy one, the right technical one, and come up with a technical solution. They have been working nights, weekends, holidays, early mornings, and just really have been tireless and amazing throughout the entire process. And of course, none of that would have been possible if we were not at the table in the inclusive framework representing U.S. interests in these discussions.
And how favorable was that ultimate guidance to U.S.?
I think it was very favorable. So it addressed two main issues for the originators of these credits, the taxpayers who engage in the projects that give rise to the credits. It treats the credits as refundable, meaning that they are treated as income rather than as a reduction in tax expense, which helps protect the value of the credits. With respect to the purchasers, they treat just the net amount, so the difference between the value of the credit and the amount paid for the credit as a benefit, and that was a huge request from stakeholder community with respect to these credits.
Again, I thank you for your service, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. I now recognize the gentleman from Kansas who's celebrating his birthday today, Mr. Estes. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm grateful you're holding this hearing. We need to take every opportunity to remind the Biden administration that the Constitution provides that Congress, not the executive branch, with the sole authority to lay and collect taxes. With that in mind, I introduced legislation with Chairman Smith last night that builds upon the first retaliation bill that we passed, or that we dropped in May. It increases exposure that foreign companies have on base erosion and anti-abuse tax, the so-called BEAT, if their home country introduces the OECD's so-called undertaxed profit rule, or UTPR. I just want to jump right into questions. Mr. Plowden, do you think U.S. businesses should pay more taxes to other countries?
First of all, Congressman, happy birthday.
Thank you.
I think it's important to, as I have mentioned, level the playing field for U.S. businesses. And Pillar 2 does level that playing field by ensuring that other countries' multinationals pay a minimum level of tax as well.
So I think a level playing field, a more level playing field, would be introduce GILTI and BEAT in other countries' tax codes as opposed to this process. With the addition of the UTPR, I mean, the 10-year projections are that the U.S. Treasury will lose $120 billion, and that U.S. corporations will pay more in taxes that will go to other companies or other countries. I'm trying to understand why the administration would do a deal that would take taxes over a 10-year period out of the U.S. Treasury, and it would cause U.S. businesses to have to pay more in taxes. I mean, what value do we get out of that over the 10-year period? That, I mean, my colleague, Mr. Schweiker, talked about the first 2 years, as you'd mentioned, but over this 10-year estimate from JCT, it's a $120 billion loss of Treasury to the Treasury if we do not change our laws. And if we do change our laws, it's almost a $60 billion loss to the U.S. Treasury.
Well, I think it's important to look at the JCT analysis as an entire picture, right? So as I mentioned, the JCT analysis describes its baseline as being 40-plus jurisdictions that it's identified that have announced plans to implement Pillar 2, and what would happen if those jurisdictions implement Pillar 2 and the U.S. does not. And that's, as I mentioned, a $400 billion swing depending on the profit-shifting assumptions that JCT uses. And again, the midpoint of that range is an increase in U.S. tax revenue from other countries implementing Pillar 2.
So what the JCT projected is that the U.S. Treasury would lose roughly $120 billion. And that's the piece that concerns us the most when we look at UTPR and the impact on this. And so let me go, we have limited time. Let me go to the next question on there is why didn't Treasury focus on getting credit, full and complete credit for the current U.S. tax code? Things like an R&D depreciation and GILTI and BEAT and some of the other provisions that are in the current U.S. tax code. Why wasn't that included in the complete negotiations through this process?
Well, I can't speak to the negotiations prior to when I rejoined Treasury. This has been an ongoing process for several years. One of the things that is clear from the Pillar 2 blueprint is that a common tax base was needed in order to be able to have a level playing field among jurisdictions. And so that's why, as far as I understand it, that's why a financial accounting tax base was adopted for Pillar 2 purposes.
But you're supportive of those provisions that were negotiated before you came on board. Otherwise, you would work to correct those. So you believe they're okay?
We are engaged in ongoing discussions on Pillar 2. And again, I think it's very important for us to continue to be engaged in those negotiations. We think it's important to take congressional input into those negotiations to interpret the rules under Pillar 2.
So I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think there's a strong consensus, not just in this committee, but across the country, certainly in the taxpaying community, that provisions such as UTPR are something that we don't want to agree with going forward, and that it's punitive and anti-American in terms of the approach that it messes that. And so there needs to be some additional work done before this is ever implemented. Thank you, and my time's expired, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now recognize Mr. Kustoff from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for appearing today. I want to follow back up on Mr. S.'s question about JCT and maybe Mr. Arrington. So we've heard the JCT estimate about the loss of $120 billion. You've disputed that, or you gave your argument against that. Has Treasury presented its argument to JCT to challenge their assumption?
Well, Congressman, I'm not challenging JCT's assumptions. All I'm doing is pointing out the totality of JCT's analysis, which, again, assumes a baseline of 40-plus jurisdictions implementing Pillar 2, and then analyzes 5 scenarios. And in each of those, again, adoption of Pillar 2 by the U.S. increases U.S. tax revenue as compared to not adopting. But I do think it's important to take into account the baseline adoption by 40 major economies in the world and many of our largest trading partners.
Well, let me ask it a different way. Do you dispute JCT's assertion about the loss of $120 billion?
All I'm pointing out is that the JCT analysis is for multiple scenarios, many of which show U.S. tax revenue increases.
You would agree with me that JCT is nonpartisan, correct?
Yes.
All right. And I asked you a question. I don't think I got a direct answer. Treasury has not disputed or gone to JCT and disputed their analysis, have they? Has Treasury disputed that with JCT?
I am not aware of Treasury disputing that analysis with JCT.
So let's assume Pillar 2 goes into effect. What I've heard from different businesses and companies is the issue of compliance and compliance cost. I mean, a real practical, pragmatic matter. And if I could, Deloitte, from their website, when they talk about Pillar 2, I want to read you this quote, and see if you can help me figure it out. Completing the new OECD Pillar 2 information return represents a global undertaking requiring hundreds of data points, many of which are complex composites of underlying data. The size and complexity of the data requirements are further complicated by timing. While in many cases, the first return has an 18-month lead time following the accounting period end, subsequent returns must be filed in less time. So even before you complete your first return, you will need to make decisions about ongoing compliance and reporting, close quote. Mr. Plowden, has the Treasury Department conducted any study or any analysis on the compliance, I'm going to say compliance burden or cost as it relates to Pillar 2 for U.S. businesses?
We share the concern about compliance burden, and this has been a central issue for our team in these discussions. And we are seeking to reduce compliance burden wherever possible. So, for example, there's a country-by-country reporting safe harbor for 2 years that provides that no top-up tax is due with respect to a jurisdiction if the country-by-country reporting shows an effective tax rate in a jurisdiction above a certain threshold. That is intended to provide taxpayers with time to phase in their compliance in various jurisdictions, focusing first on the highest risk jurisdictions. There's also a, in the Globe information return, so the Pillar 2 tax return that was released on Monday, there is a 5-year transition period that provides for jurisdictional reporting as opposed to entity-by-entity reporting. That, again, was intended to reduce compliance burden for taxpayers by reducing the amount of specific information that needs to be provided.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. Let me ask my question again. Has Treasury conducted any study as it relates to the issue of compliance or compliance cost?
I am not aware of any such study.
Okay, fair enough. So Treasury, let me just ask as my time expires, Treasury has no data as it relates to the issue of compliance or compliance cost, correct?
Again, I'm not aware of any study in that regard.
If there was, would you agree to share that with this committee?
I can check on that and get back to the committee.
Can you let us know one way or the other whether that exists? Will you agree to that?
I will check on that and get back to the
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Delbany, for 5 minutes.
From the great state of Washington, Mr. Chairman.
From the great state of Washington.
There you go, there you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Plowden, thank you so much for being here today and for your time. You've highlighted the many reasons why the United States needs to stay engaged in the Pillar 2 negotiations, and given that the treatment of various tax credits has been a key part of the conversation, I wondered if you could talk specifically about a particular credit that I know has been strongly supported in a bipartisan fashion, is very supportive in our communities, which is the low-income housing tax credits, and kind of how Pillar 2 would treat LIHTC.
Absolutely. So this was an issue that when the model rules were released, we received input from Congress and from stakeholders about the need for additional guidance about economic development credits, and in particular the low-income housing tax credit. And certainly the administration has shared those concerns. And we have been able, through the negotiations, to secure administrative guidance that was released in February that provides that what's known as qualified flow-through tax benefits are protected under the Pillar 2 rules. And what that means is that tax credits that are used in tax equity partnerships, which are the common structure for investments in low-income housing tax credits, are protected. They're treated as qualified flow-through tax benefits. And this was definitely something that is unique to the U.S., these structures. And so it took a while to explain really to our counterparts what these were, why they were needed. But it's something that was very important to us, and the LIHTC is the largest and most effective federal program that we have that encourages development of affordable housing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Also, we saw the announcement last week that more than 130 countries have agreed to refrain from imposing digital services taxes for an additional year while work continues on the implementation of global tax reform. But Canada was one of 5 countries who did not agree to the moratorium extension. Mr. Plowgen, I wondered if you could describe the steps that U.S. Treasury and the administration are taking to address the Canadian government's continued interest in pursuing a digital services tax that targets U.S. companies and workers, given that this would have serious tax and trade implications, and again, for us going forward. And so I wondered if you could address that and what steps you might be taking.
Absolutely. This is a critical issue, and as you stated, the outcome statement, 138 countries joined in extending the standstill on DSTs. Treasury is engaged with Canada at all levels, including Secretary Yellen, to dissuade them from implementing a discriminatory DST. The administration more broadly is engaged with Canada as well, through the interagency process, and other agencies have raised this issue with their Canadian counterparts. Implementation of a DST by Canada would seriously undermine the Pillar 1 negotiations, and as you saw, actually, Canada was isolated on this issue. The other countries were not necessarily objecting to DST standstill. It was other issues that caused them not to join the outcome statement. But with respect to Canada, we are exploring all options, and we would like to work with Congress to address that issue.
Thank you. Thank you again for being with us today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady from Washington. Now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Smith Van Dyne.
Well, I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman. I continue to be shocked that this administration would cede U.S. sovereignty to allow other countries to dictate changes to the U.S. tax code. And this administration could not convince Congress to pass its extremist tax hike agenda. So it's basically given the keys to our tax writers to Paris. Whoever drafted this plan has to understand that this attacks our tax base, our economic strength, and it transfers wealth from the U.S. to countries abroad, and it benefits countries abroad. It benefits workers abroad, not American workers. So we've talked about this, but I'm not sure I've really gotten an answer. So the Joint Commission on Taxation estimates that the U.S. would lose over $120 billion in tax revenues. Do you agree with that number? I mean, you've given reasons why it may or may not, but do you agree with how they got to that number?
Well, as I've mentioned, the JCT analysis looks at multiple scenarios, right? And again, I think it's important to look at the baseline in the JCT analysis. The JCT analysis baseline is adoption of Pillar 2 by 40-plus jurisdictions, many of our largest trading partners and major economies. And again, the midpoint of their range for the impact of adoption by other countries of Pillar 2 on U.S. tax receipts is a $25 billion increase in U.S. tax receipts.
So that's the midpoint, but as you mentioned, I mean, they're looking at a number of different scenarios, which I would hope that our own Treasury would look at. So can you tell me what the U.S. Treasury has defined as would be the loss or the gain?
The Treasury Department has provided estimates on the adoption of the administration's Green Book proposals to enact Pillar 2.
So you've done an independent analysis?
On the adoption of the administration's proposals to enact Pillar 2, yes.
Okay, so have those been shared with
Those have been shared with Congress and have been made publicly available.
Okay, so what was your number?
I unfortunately do not recall off the top of my head, but it's multiple hundreds of billions of dollars.
So the Treasury is saying that as a result of this, we're going to make a ton more money, even though what we're doing is allowing foreign nations to be able to define our tax codes. And we are so sure that European countries are going to be so favorable to U.S. companies and not want to be competitive at all?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. No, the Treasury has provided estimates of U.S. adoption of Pillar 2, yes.
And this is based on which of the scenarios that JCT used?
This is based on U.S. adoption of Pillar 2.
Correct, but JCT used a number of different variables. What's the Treasury's variables?
I don't think it aligns perfectly with JCT's analysis.
So how could they be so far off?
Well, I think they do analyze different scenarios.
But you just said that you're using the same. So which is it? Is it similar or is it not similar? And what's the different numbers that they're using that you're not using?
I did not say that they were the same. So our Treasury's analysis assumes no change in foreign law, which is the convention for revenue estimating.
So we're expecting that they're not going to change anything and that we're just going to have a free fall of dollars. Okay, makes sense. I mean, no offense to our European friends, but the U.S. has taken a much more aggressive approach when it comes to corporate tax rates, and we have seen that we've been rewarded with growth. In 2008, the U.S. and EU were equally the same size. By 2022, the U.S. economy had grown to $25 trillion, whereas the EU and the UK together had only reached $19.8 trillion. America's economy is now nearly 1/3 bigger. It's more than 50% larger than the EU without the UK. So to be this tax deal seems like a race to the bottom and not what Republicans have been accused of at all. We continue to hear from the other side of the aisle that TCJA was a tax scam and created corporate loopholes. Yet in 2022, corporate tax revenues reached a record high of $425 billion, or 43% higher than the final year of the Obama administration. And on top of that, the TCJA included the world's first global minimum tax. So can you please define what's meant for companies by the phrase pay their fair share that continues to be used to justify this continued attack on U.S. Corporate base?
Well, I think the goals of the Pillar 2 project are to level the playing field for
No, I'm asking, can you define pay their fair share? Is there a percentage that the administration would deem fair? Is there an amount, a dollar amount?
Again, I can speak to the Pillar 2 project, which is to level the playing field for U.S. businesses.
Maybe, but you're repeating the same talking points. Specifically, the phrase pay their fair share continues to be used. And I'm asking, is there a dollar amount, is there a percentage that's, quote, fair?
I do not have a dollar amount.
Do you have a percentage?
No.
Okay, I yield back, thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you know, Mr. Plugin, we don't live in a parliamentary system like many of our negotiating partners. And the Treasury does not have the authority to rewrite tax law in our system, and we just noted that. But you noted that you think it's a need for a common international tax base to exist, and yet you don't have any authority. Did you tell our counterparts that you guys have really no authority, that you can negotiate, but you have no authority to pass this?
I think it's well known that only Congress has the authority to change U.S. tax laws, and certainly my counterparts are aware of that.
Okay, thank you for saying that. So how does this move forward if we can't get it through Congress?
Well, other countries are moving forward with Pillar 2 and implementing them.
But if they go down that path, and a government says, they say we're not going to pay the tax. I mean, don't you see this as a massive lawsuit just waiting to happen? You guys are trotting down this path, but if I'm a multinational corporation or a business, whatever, I'm going to say, wait a minute, no.
They would not comply with foreign countries' laws. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, we already have guilty, all right? And that was passed through Congress. So the multinational companies would simply say, no, we're not going to pay, this extra. I mean, it could happen that we don't have to do the top-up tax or whatever it might be.
The Pillar 2 rules are taxes imposed by a jurisdiction on residents
Correct.
in that jurisdiction.
Fully understand.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me push this a little further. Did Treasury recognize that the UTPR's treatment of non-refundable credits would disproportionately harm U.S. competitiveness? I mean, what you're doing here is Treasury is favoring cash grants and refundable credits over non-refundable credits, which in essence uniquely harm U.S. Is that a fair statement?
Well, the Pillar 2 rules, again, level the playing field for U.S. multinationals by ensuring that all multinationals pay a minimum level of tax.
Yeah, right. Refundable credits do, but how about all the non-refundable credits, right? We got a massive problem here that you didn't take into consideration that everything, from Europe, they do a lot of refundable credits. We don't. And so we're at a dramatic disadvantage, correct? I mean, look at the R&D credit. We don't have a refundable R&D credit. So now it can't be used. That puts us at a dramatic disadvantage, correct?
So certainly we share the concerns about the R&D credit. We think that is an important incentive.
But it's not only the R&D credit, it's many of our credits, right? We have very few refundable credits. A lot of European nations, they have gone down that path of refundable credits. We haven't. I mean, it dramatically puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Why did Treasury agree to allow UTPR to stack on top of the corporate minimum tax and the U.S. GILTI tax rules? Why did the Treasury allow this to happen? Why did the Biden administration deprioritize the fair treatment of GILTI?
Again, the Pillar 2 rules are necessary in order to create a level playing field. And
but you're again, so we're not really care about GILTI, and we're deprioritizing GILTI then?
The UTPR, which you asked about, is necessary as an enforcement mechanism to ensure that there's not a competitive advantage that can be gained by China or other jurisdictions.
So what you're doing is you're giving the middle finger to all our corporations and saying, you know what, we're going to stack these things on top of each other. In essence, that's what you're doing. Why did the Treasury agree to allowing Pillar 2 domestic top-up taxes with their special carve-outs to CCP state subsidiaries take priority over U.S. anti-abuse rules of subpart F and GILTI?
The qualified domestic minimum top-up tax rules are consistent with all other international tax rules, which provide a primary taxing right to a jurisdiction taxing its own residents on income that is sourced to that jurisdiction. The way our foreign tax credit rules work, we provide a foreign tax credit for taxes paid to foreign jurisdictions.
So China gets special privilege, but not the U.S. I mean, this is my great concern is every time we look at this Pillar 2, we are at a disadvantage. And I just laid out 3 different things, how we are at a disadvantage. Not to say that it's non-binding. I mean, you have no jurisdiction to allow this to occur. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, and thank you, Mr. Assistant Deputy Secretary, for your patience here today. I had one compliment for the Republicans regarding their Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and it was that they imposed GILTI to make sure that we were not contributing or leading a race to the bottom. I thought it was a very bold move on their part. Many of our colleagues have already asked you today of why you didn't find GILTI, or why the OECD didn't find GILTI to be totally compliant with what is now the proposed GLOBE rule. Is it because it continues to blend those tax rates and still creates the incentive to seek out low tax jurisdictions?
Well, as I mentioned, I cannot speak precisely to the negotiations before my arrival. The October 2021 statement does suggest that the global blending of GILTI was a significant consideration in that regard.
I'm sorry, it was a consideration. It was, but I mean, my question to you was, okay, I'll just move on since you don't seem to know. Let me ask you it this way. Does GILTI still provide the opportunity for the United States multinational enterprises to blend and still incentivizes them to place their profits in low tax jurisdictions.
Yes, absolutely.
So the race to the bottom is still on. Thank you.
Yes.
Mr. Schweikert, I want to ask you a series of questions about the JCT report with the wide $400 billion swing. And so many here just say we just should do nothing. And if we do nothing, this, there's no indication that the rest of the world is not going to adopt GLOBE. And that is when we would lose hundreds of billions of dollars by not participating. Is that right?
Yes, in every scenario that the JCT
Okay,
analyzes,
thank you.
it's better for the U.S. to adopt Pillar
Okay,
2.
then they also talked about even if we comply, that there'd be a loss. But wouldn't that be, is the reason that you can't tease out these differentiations is because if you leave, your taxing authority in Ireland, or your product in Ireland versus France, which has a 25% corporate tax rate, versus Ireland, which has 12%, that matters with regard to how much profit you'll earn.
Yes, and in fact, one of the major assumptions that drives the range is the effect of Pillar 2 on profit shifting. And the analysts that have looked at this have concluded that Pillar 2 would reduce the profit shifting by multinationals into low
So in other words, if you kept the profit in the United States, that's when you get to those upper limits of revenue.
Absolutely.
Keeping money here in the great old USA. Thank you. Other members have questions about providing monies to other places. I'm thinking now of like so-called third world countries. Does this legislation, the GLOBE framework, incentivize other countries, not forcing them, but incentivize them to raise their corporate taxes to inure to the benefit of their country? And of course, we would get a foreign tax credit for having to pay that. Is that correct?
That's right. That especially as you mentioned, developing countries do rely heavily on the corporate income tax, and they rely on corporate income tax incentives to attract investment.
We could really help out a lot, huh?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Analysts expect Pillar 2 would help with that.
Thank you. I don't have as much time as the chairman, so let me move on. The UTPR, there's a lot of focus on that. And so my question is that there's a lot of rage about it, but if we are compliant with the regimen, is there some scenario where, countries all over willy-nilly will be grabbing our money if we're compliant? Isn't the point of this is to make sure that people comply?
Yes, if the U.S. companies are subject to a 15% minimum tax, in the U.S., they would not pay the
So
UTPR.
if I've got two children and I tell two sisters and I say, look, I'm going to give your allowance to your sister. If she has to make up your bed every day, you make your bed up. And then the other sister just decries, oh, she's going to take my allowance away, take it away, take it away. If you just make your bed up, that wouldn't happen. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentle lady from New York, Ms. Maliotakis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to echo my colleagues' concerns and opinions, which is the truth, which is that Treasury is taking Congress's tax writing authority and giving it to unelected bureaucrats in Paris. They're giving it to foreign governments. It really doesn't make any sense, and it's not something I think that this committee will be tolerating. Congress is giving our opinion, and you know, in response to Chairman Smith, you said that you take our input. Well, I hope you actually listen to it, and I hope you're listening to the input of American businesses all across the country that are concerned about what this means in terms of compliance, how they're going to be able. It's very complicated. It sounds like it's going to be a complete accounting nightmare that will require them to divulge proprietary information, massive number of data points to comply. And there's been no regulations put out. So there's some guidance that came out earlier this week, but I think there's a lot of people all across the country that are concerned that this will certainly put American businesses at a disadvantage. And look, the deal is just a bad deal for the United States, no matter how you look at it, as my colleague just laid out a couple of points. It eliminates our competitive advantage. and our government can lose $120 billion in tax revenue to foreign governments. And that's not according to Republicans on this committee. That's according to the Joint Committee on Taxation. And Treasury does not protect our status as the first country to enact a global minimum tax. And the U.S. will be targeted with 40% of the tax burden under Pillar 2 and 60% of the tax pillar under Pillar 1. I don't know how you can agree to that. China's state subsidies are more protected than ordinary tax incentives like R&D tax credits here in the United States. And I think that we've all alluded to this, and we believe it, that China will avoid these higher taxes that are under Pillar 2 because the CCP will use direct state subsidies to hide the true tax rate paid by Chinese-controlled entities. So how do you intend to enforce this UTPR tax rule, both for domestically with American companies, but also with our competitors like Communist China?
Well, I'd like to say that we do take congressional input very seriously. We do meet with U.S. businesses and other stakeholders regularly in the Office of Tax Policy, and we take that input into the negotiations. With respect to the UTPR...
I find it hard to believe that you're taking input from American businesses and from members of Congress that would put us at such a disadvantage and would really put American companies at a disadvantage. But go on with the Communist China. How are you going to make sure that they commit to their end? And I guess I'll add a second part to that question. What about the countries that have not joined this agreement? Aren't there concerns that now America will be less competitive with them?
Well, I think that's exactly the point that you raised with the UTPR. The UTPR is the enforcement mechanism for the Pillar 2 rules, and the UTPR provides that implementing jurisdictions will impose tax on their residents, and if the multinational group is not subject to a 15% minimum rate in each jurisdiction in which it operates. And so that is how the rules work. That's how they ensure a level playing field. It's how we ensure that China and other jurisdictions that don't implement the rules do not have a competitive advantage by staying outside of the deal.
Okay, that doesn't really, I don't think, make sense to most people. But Secretary Yellen has yet to share Treasury's economic analysis of Pillar 1 with Congress. Why? Why does she refuse to share this information with Congress when she knows that all tax treaties must be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate? I mean, how do you expect a deal to be ratified if she won't even share this critical information to be able to evaluate it on its merits? All we've seen so far is generic guidance adopted in France.
Yeah, so the Pillar 1 negotiations, as I mentioned, continue to have important economic terms that remain open. And those include how the Pillar 1 taxing right is coordinated with the existing international tax system. And when we are able to resolve those issues, we plan to share estimates with Congress.
When do you anticipate that?
I don't know exactly when that will be. I need to, obviously, those issues need to be resolved with negotiating partners.
Okay, well, my time's expired. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. I now recognize the gentlelady from West Virginia, Mrs. Miller. Gentlelady, turn your mic on, please. Carol, we still can't hear you.
We'll try a different one then.
There we go.
I'll have to get a real long neck going here. Okay. Thank you, Chairman Kelly and Member Thompson. I'm pleased that you, Mr. Plowgen, have come here today to answer some of our questions. However, I am really incredibly disappointed and quite frankly disgusted by the Biden administration's abject failure to negotiate in America's best interests at the OECD. In my view, you and your colleagues have completely failed your fiduciary responsibility to the American taxpayers, American workers, and American companies. I realize that you haven't been involved in all of this, but you're here now, and this administration's failure is shameful. It's reprehensible and downright outrageous. It's really hard for me to believe. The American people empower you to negotiate on their behalf, and instead you've surrendered to global socialist tax scheme that will ultimately make America poorer and less competitive, placing our children and grandchildren, our children and our grandchildren, their future at risk. Not to mention that you've denigrated our nation's status as a beacon of strength, democracy, and capitalism in an increasingly dangerous world. There are two news headlines just this week. On July 17th, the Wall Street Journal wrote that Europeans are becoming poorer. Yes, we're all worse off, says the Bank of England's chief economist. And from the Washington Post just yesterday, quote, Britain should stop pretending it's a rich country. These articles drive into how Europe's heavy subsidies, overpromised social spending, and the lack of innovation have led to slow growth, lower wages, and less spending and prosperity. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit these two articles for the record.
So approved.
Mr. Plowgen, I just can't comprehend why the Treasury would put the United States in a position to be forced by unelected global bureaucrats to give up our strong economy to match the failures of our allies abroad. Is the Biden administration willing to reverse course and fight at the OECD to ensure our proven tax incentives like the research and development credit or the low-income housing tax credit are fully protected?
It's been a shared and consistent priority across the administrations that have participated in these negotiations to protect U.S. interests, to protect U.S. businesses, and to protect American workers.
That sounds more like no to me.
We continue to take input from Congress and from U.S. businesses into these discussions and continue to raise these important issues for the United States.
Like our chairman, I'd like to have proof of that, please. Do you consider socialism to be a key goal of the Biden administration? I guess that's no. The OECD Tax Project is a thinly veiled attempt to neuter the U.S. economy and drive America into the arms of global socialism. Europe's economy struggles to adapt to the modern world, and these countries aim to capture our U.S. dollars to fund their socialist programs and government handouts. So I'm just really concerned. While the OECD's proposed deal would protect refundable tax credits, also known as direct subsidy, most U.S. tax credits are not refundable, and for good reason. The U.S. is the most innovative nation on the planet, and we attract the best and brightest to start and grow their businesses here. We do not need direct government checks payable to industry, nor should we offer them. Many countries in Europe don't prize innovation or competitiveness like we do, and that's why so many of them come to the United States. So these countries have the sovereign right to determine their own tax code, incentive structures, and national agendas. They do not have the right to try and fund themselves with U.S. tax dollars, no matter what the Treasury Department might think. Congress writes the rules. The administration administers them. I yield back my time.
Thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Plowgen, thank you for sitting through this. I greatly appreciate all of your work negotiating, and I have great affection and respect for my Republican friends on this committee, but I think in my only 4.5 years on this committee, this is the greatest misunderstanding of what this legislation does that I've ever seen. I was U.S. Ambassador to Switzerland for 4 years in the midst of all the fights over taxes. And one of the things I saw there is that there's an enormous amount of tax evasion and tax cheating by major global corporations, not just American, hiding assets or putting all of their costs in the high tax states, like the United States and the UK and the like, and putting all of their revenues in the low tax places, 3%, 0%, 1%. I won't do ad hominem attacks on countries, but you don't have to be really creative. I'll be happy to tell you who they were. And this is the entire world community coming together and saying, we need to stop the tax cheating. We need to make sure that we stand up to those small little countries, many of them just islands, who take all the revenue, don't charge any taxes at all, but that 1% or 2% is enough to make them happy. In the meantime, my family business, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary Sunday morning, has been paying 37% for years. And before that, as Mike knows, 39.6%. And it makes me upset that somebody much, much bigger than I am is paying 3%, 5%, 6%. This lack of the sovereignty thing is the emptiest issue I've ever seen. Mr. Pelagian and Janet Yellen cannot impose this tax on us. We can do it. We're the only people who can raise the tax from 10.5% to 15 to 20, whatever. We have complete autonomy. We have not given our sovereignty away to anybody else. When we say those other people will be able to tax us, they're just looking at under-taxed jurisdictions and saying, we are now going to charge them more in Poland, in Ukraine, in France, in India, because for the country that is under-taxed itself. That's designed not to go after us at 10.5 or 11%. It's designed to go after the country that's at 3% and 2% and 1%. And we're not changing it. They're changing their own tax policies for U.S. companies that are doing business in their countries and are being undertaxed. So it's most of these arguments just have not made any sense at all. The one that has, Ms. Miller brought up, is the concern that we should have about our tax incentives. Things like the housing tax credit, the green energy tax credits, things like that. Mr. Pelagian, I've been told by administration officials that we were working hard to make sure that our tax incentive structures we would put in place are not going to hurt our companies. Because that's not a matter of us hiding revenues in low tax jurisdictions, that's taking advantage of everything. Can you assure me that we're going to work as hard as we can to make sure that this new guilty regime, we're going to do our best to avoid them affecting our tax credits? And before you answer, one last point. LPTR is not a decision we make. These are decisions that other countries around the world are making to increase their own taxes on revenues in their country to penalize the tax havens that are undertaxing. And to the extent that we're under by 1.5%, 3%, it's a relatively small amount. By the way, that's taxes that we were not collecting anyway. We weren't collecting it, and now they're saying they're going to collect it because we won't. We're not shifting tax revenue at all. Mr. Pelagian, I give the floor to you.
Yes, absolutely. We continue to prioritize U.S. incentives in these discussions. We've been able to agree on interpretive guidance that protects many of the incentives that we've been talking about today, the low-income housing tax credit, green energy credits, other transferable credits, and we continue to raise these in the discussions.
Yeah, I also want to make the point fast to Mr. Pelagian that in no way is insisting that international corporations who have been purposefully cheating on their taxes, avoiding taxes through great manipulation, is a move to global socialism. It just doesn't make any sense at all. What we're trying to do is make sure that everybody's playing by the same rules. And at least that U.S. corporations are being treated fairly at all times. Mr. Chairman, thank you for leading this. I yield back. Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Tenney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I'm grateful that we're holding this hearing today to examine President Biden's global tax surrender. Ways and Means Republicans have been sounding the alarm over the framework negotiated between President Biden's Treasury Department, Janet Yellen, and the OECD. This comprehensive rewrite of global tax rules championed by the administration would result in fewer U.S. tax revenues, reduce the global competitiveness of U.S. companies, and erode our overall economic strength. It amounts to nothing more than surrendering American tax sovereignty, with U.S. taxpayers sending a check to the tune of billions and billions of dollars to foreign countries. In fact, according to analysis from the Joint Committee on Taxation, the United States could stand to lose as much as $120 billion in tax revenue under the global minimum tax negotiated by the Biden administration. On top of that, OECD released recent guidance which substantiated the Republicans' concerns. President Biden's tax deal is unworkable and it's ill-conceived. This guidance does nothing to address my concerns, only serves to underscore the deal's fatal flaws, particularly on the undertaxed profits rule, which will send critical research and development abroad. Had Treasury consulted with Congress instead of completely neglecting the American people, perhaps they would have avoided these pitfalls. And I want to make sure I emphasize what the chairman had talked about earlier. Just accepting letters from the majority is not negotiating or working with us in terms of consulting. So I want to turn my questions to you, and thank you, sir, for your service and for being here. But Mr. Ploujian, the United States is the world's economic superpower, but we represent just 25% of the global GDP, 15% if adjusted for purchasing power. Multiple independent economic experts have found that the OECD deal would disproportionately impact the United States. My first question is, why would Treasury agree to a Pillar 1 framework where U.S. companies face 60% of the total burden of profit reallocation?
I'm sorry, Congresswoman, with respect to your question, are you, which pillar are you referring to?
Pillar 1.
Pillar 1. So a consistent priority across the administrations, the different administrations that have been involved in these negotiations, has been to protect U.S. interests, to protect U.S. businesses, and to protect U.S. workers. In particular, with respect to Pillar 1, one of the main purposes behind the negotiations, and this is based on input on a bipartisan basis from Congress, is to get rid of and prevent.
Okay, go ahead. Let me ask you, so do you think it's beneficial to the United States companies to pay more in taxes? I guess was that the decision that was made in implementing this?
Well, I don't think that Pillar 1 necessarily does that. So what?
Well, can I ask you, do you disagree with the Joint Committee on Taxation's assessment of the $120 billion tax revenue loss under the global minimum tax negotiated by Janet Yellen, Secretary Yellen?
So under Pillar 2, the JCT analysis actually shows multiple different scenarios. And again, with respect to the baseline that the JCT analysis uses, which is implementation of Pillar 2 by more than 40 of our largest trading partners, the midpoint of their range is an increase in U.S. tax revenue from other countries implementing Pillar 2. And indeed, in Scenario 5, which shows implementation by those same 40-plus jurisdictions, plus implementation by the U.S., they show.
So let me ask you, you didn't answer my question. Do you think that the Joint Committee on Taxation's numbers are wrong, regardless? So in your opinion, the U.S. companies will net a greater tax revenue and will not be penalized under the entire plan?
The JCT analysis shows that the U.S. gains revenue in multiple of those scenarios.
But they net gain revenue.
Yes.
And how do you come up with that conclusion?
Scenario 5 by the JCT shows an increase in U.S. tax revenues of $236.5 billion over the 10-year window.
And what's that analysis based on?
That analysis
is that an assumption that there's going to be greater trade, or we're not sure of that?
The assumptions that the JCT uses for Scenario 5 is adoption by the 40-plus jurisdictions and adoption by the U.S. of Pillar 2.
But don't you think that's a surrender of our sovereignty to give the right of other countries to tax our own entities in a way that we're not even doing ourselves, and then to put this in an unfair trading position in the end?
Well, all countries have the sovereign right to tax their residents under their corporate tax
system.
Right,
but aren't we surrendering our right? We're subjecting our U.S.-based companies who are competing abroad to this unfair scheme.
The Pillar 2 rules are taxes imposed by jurisdictions on their own residents.
I understand. So, but overall, we're going to end up losing because we're penalizing our own U.S.-based companies when they try to compete in the foreign market. And I think my time has expired, so I'll have to talk to you about it further in another time. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlelady. We now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Steele.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this important hearing. I'd love to yield my colleague to my colleague from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn.
Mr. Plowden, just to follow up on my two letters and then what Ms. Tenney just responded to, are the JCT assumptions based on information, work product that you've given them to do an analysis on their assumptions of revenue loss or gain?
So certainly the Treasury estimators.
So yes or no, if you've given them information or not.
My understanding is that the Treasury estimators do speak with their JCT colleagues on a regular basis.
So then it's a yes, you've given it to JCT then. I was just curious because, again, we haven't seen it in Congress. So as long as they have it and we're basing these estimates off of your work product, that would be interesting to know. Thank you. I yield back.
I'm very generous with my time today, so I am yielding to my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank the gentlelady. Mr. Plowden, is it appropriate to allow one state or country to collect income tax on income earned outside its border?
So the way the international
Yes
tax
or no? Is it appropriate
rules-
to allow one state or country to collect income tax earned on income outside its border?
Well, the United States collects income tax on the income of CFCs that operate outside of the U.S. So
our treaties allow that?
Our treaties allow that, yes.
So if that's so, couldn't we just tax foreign companies here on income earned outside the U.S.?
The saving clause in our treaties allows the parties to the treaty to tax their residents, generally without regard to the treaty. So we have always taken the position that guilty and subpart F are consistent with our treaties.
But wouldn't that, if we start taxing companies in other countries on income that they've earned outside of the U.S., don't you think that would lead to tax or trade disputes with the home country?
We currently do tax income earned by entities in other jurisdictions. So we tax the U.S. entity with respect to income earned by CFCs in other jurisdictions under guilty and subpart F.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this is very important discussions that we are having, and thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary, that you are coming out. And I hope that Treasury moving forward will work with this committee and fight for U.S. businesses. But having said that, that you're on your statement, you said Pillar 2, which would increase U.S. revenue and strengthen our tax system. And Pillar 2 will be fairer, if I said something that you didn't say, please let me know, on the world stage. So better be in Pillar 2 than not in Pillar 2. So my concern on Pillar 2 is actually all the members already stated that 60% of total, actually that's the Pillar 1, Pillar 2, that total burden, that nearly 40% of additional tax burden for Pillar 2 that for U.S. companies. So could you explain that why you are saying that without any detailed technical issues that we resolve before we implement this, that you're already saying that how it can increase U.S. revenue and strengthen, and then why it has to be fairer, and then why we have to be in Pillar 2, not in Pillar 2?
Yes, absolutely. The JCT analysis shows that in all scenarios that they analyzed, that U.S. adoption of Pillar 2 increases U.S. revenue as compared to not adopting Pillar 2. Similarly, the Treasury estimates for the administration's Green Book proposals to adopt reforms consistent with Pillar 2 show a significant revenue increase for the U.S. of adopting those reforms.
Okay. I still have a problem with double taxation for our corporations here. Having said that, I don't have enough time, so I'm going to just say a really quick statement here. I was born in Korea and raised in Japan, and it is great that we live in a global world that allows international commerce. But I'm here to advocate for my constituents from Southern California. And could you and will you, and Treasury, commit today to negotiate with OECD rules that are equitable across countries on behalf of my constituents? And I can't, in good faith, sign off on policies without knowing how it would affect our constituents and communities. Will you commit today to provide Congress and critical details going forward and bring all the important issues on Pillar 2 before we implement Pillar 2? Just yes and no question because I'm already over my time.
Yes, we do take U.S. interests and U.S. business interests into the negotiations, and I can commit to taking those into the negotiations. And we have provided estimates on Pillar 2 to Congress and made them publicly available.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I think the gentlelady now would turn to Mr. Snyder from Illinois. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Plowden, thank you for your patience. I know it's been a long afternoon. I'm going to review some of the things. And you started in your testimony, we talked about the BEPS project, or the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting project. That was the genesis of this whole initiative. What was the motivation for that project?
It was concern about the ability of multinationals to shift profits into low-tax jurisdictions, essentially.
And what was the goals that the countries participating set for the project?
The basic idea was to try to develop reforms to the international tax rules to prevent multinationals from being able to shift profits into low-tax jurisdictions.
And as we sit here now more than a decade later and we're talking about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, that often gets confusing. We've got initials like UTPR. What's your sense of the commitment to the G20 countries to actually moving forward and addressing the original motivations of the BEPS project and what they're trying to achieve with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2?
Well, the G20 finance ministers earlier this week reiterated their support for the two-pillar solution and in particular, the steps the countries are taking to implement Pillar 2.
So is it fair to say that irrespective of what we might do in the United States, countries around the world, developed countries around the world are going to move forward here?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Now, we've also talked about this JCT analysis, and my colleagues have been focusing on one of the scenario numbers, but there are multiple scenarios. What's the key distinction between each of the different scenarios?
The key distinctions between the different scenarios are assumptions about which jurisdictions implement. There are several scenarios in which the U.S. implements Pillar 2. There are several scenarios in which the U.S. does not implement Pillar 2. And then there's this distinction between just the 40 baseline or 40-plus baseline jurisdictions adopting versus every single country in the world adopting.
Okay, and what happens if the rest of the world moves forward, and as you noted, the leading economies are committed to moving forward, and the United States stays on the sidelines? What happens then?
Yes, so if the entire rest of the world adopts Pillar 2, which is the JCT scenario 1, and the U.S. stays on the sidelines, that's the $122 billion number that's been talked a lot about in this hearing. They find that the U.S. would lose $122 billion of revenue.
And the logic behind that is that, and one of the numbers I saw is an estimate of 75% of the profits that are now located in low-taxed jurisdictions like the Canary Islands or Bermuda is going to move to more the G20 economies. The assumption is it would all move to these other economies, not to the United States. Is that correct?
I think that's a large driver of the numbers.
But are there things that the United States could do to make it more attractive for these companies to move their profits from Bermuda back to the United States?
Yes, and in fact, we believe that Pillar 2 does make it more attractive for companies to move their profits back to the United States because it reduces the tax incentive to shift profits out of the U.S. to low-tax jurisdictions. And in fact, OECD and IMF analysis has suggested that reducing the tax rate differentials between the U.S. and offshore centers would significantly increase investment in the U.S.
So if instead of fighting amongst ourselves, we put our heads together and came up with strategic actions as a body to make sure that the United States remains as the innovative place in the world, actually, we wouldn't see a decline in taxes, but by the JCT model, we'd see an increase in revenues to the United States. Is that correct?
That's correct. And certainly Pillar 2 is part of that. In every scenario, if the U.S. adopts Pillar 2, the JCT shows an increase in U.S. tax revenue as compared to the U.S. not adopting.
Okay. And let me finish on one other thing, because I am worried about R&D, and I know we talked about it a little bit. And this wasn't my observation, but I think it's an important observation. 2.5 years ago, we entered into what was a dark moment for the country with the pandemic, for the world, as the world shut down. All of the scientists around the world gathered together, or worked together, to try to come up with some response, treatments for COVID, vaccines for COVID, and countries tested some. As we sit here 2.5 years later, there are 3 vaccines that are standing, that are desired by the world. All 3 of those were invented here in the United States because we have the greatest innovation, R&D system. We incentivize it, we motivate it, we support it. I do want to make sure as we go forward, and I think it is a fair concern, that whatever we do with Pillar 2, make sure that we protect those incentives, those reasons for companies, the best companies in the world, to base their research and development in the United States, to bring the smartest people and hire the smartest people in the United States, and make sure, God forbid, there's another pandemic, or we have the next revolution, AI, or whatever's coming next, that those innovations are happening in the United States. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Plotch, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here today and for being patient and enduring as we go through this, because I've got to tell you, I think the main thing that has bothered me since the beginning of this is the constitutionality of what the administration is doing. There's 3 distinct parts of our government, and I just think when we look at trade policy, when we look at tax policy, all that begins in the House, and I'm just trying to understand why the administration would go outside that model and decide to do something on its own. So I'm going to encourage you to keep in touch with us. The people that asked you to get back with me, asked you some questions that you said you get back with them. Please do that, and thank you so much for being here today. We're now going to move to the second panel. Now recognize the second panel, and I want to thank you all for going through this process, and I saw you out in the back seats, but thank you all for staying with us. First of all, Ms. Ms. Mindy Hirschfeld serves as a professor of tax practice at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. She is also a counsel for the Potomac Law Group and a contributing editor for the publication Tax Notes. Ms. Hirschfeld, thank you for being here. Adam Michel is the Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Mr. Michel, thank you so much for being here. Ann Gordon is the Vice President for International Tax Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council. Ms. Gordon, thank you so much for being here. Mr. David Scheitzer is a Dean of Emeritus and Harvey R. Miller Professor of Law and Economics at Columbia Law School. Mr. Scheitzer, thank you for being here. Mr. Peter Barnes is an International Tax Advisor and the Counsel at the Kaplan and Drysdale. He is also a Senior Fellow at Duke University. It's nice to have the Blue Devils here. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today, and I hope we can continue on. I just want to make sure that we understand the whole purpose of what we're trying to do today. And I think that sometimes we get caught up in floor speeches. The real problem, and I just addressed at the end of the first, is the constitutionality of the administration and the movement that they're making without being the counsel of the Congress. And so we'll begin now. Ms. Hirschfeld, each of you, please, you have 5 minutes. Mr. Hearn is going to take over as the chairman. Thank you so much.
Chairman Kelly, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today on this important topic. The background to my testimony is the Joint Committee on Taxation's recent analysis estimating that Pillar 2 of the OECD agreement for a global minimum tax will impose significant costs on the U.S. government. To put the two-pillar project in perspective, I'll start by sketching out the international tax principles that have been in place since the early 20th century, followed by changes introduced by the OECD's project to crack down on cross-border base erosion and profit shifting, known as BEPS, and the U.S. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Together, BEPS and the TCJA set the stage for the 2021 two-pillar agreement. I'll explain why certain aspects of that agreement negatively impact U.S. revenues, but then turn to what might be done to fix it. From its earliest days, the U.S. income tax system, as applied to taxing U.S. persons' foreign earnings, can be characterized by 3 principles. First, U.S. persons are taxed on all of their income, regardless of where earned. Second, the United States provides U.S. taxpayers with a credit for foreign taxes paid. And third, in general, U.S. tax law respects corporate entities as separate taxpayers and historically has not subjected foreign companies' earnings to U.S. tax until repatriated. Now, beginning in 2013, the G20 and the OECD undertook a project to address cross-border profit shifting and digitalization of the economy. This BEPS project fell short, though, in 2 respects. One, it didn't develop concrete proposals for taxing the digitalized economy. And 2, a U.S. push to encourage expanded adoption of controlled foreign corporation regimes mostly failed. But these missed opportunities have been revived in the OECD's current work. Now, partly in response to the same pressures that prompted BEPS, the TCJA introduced a number of important changes to U.S. international tax rules. Most importantly, in enacting GILTI, the U.S. became the first mover in adopting a global minimum tax. Now, unfinished business from the BEPS project led other countries to propose and enact digital services taxes. To limit such efforts, the OECD undertook what's sometimes referred to as BEPS 2.0, which includes the 2 pillars. Pillar 1 remains focused on taxing large, highly profitable multinationals, disproportionately impacting U.S. tech companies, and reallocates a share of their profits to market economies. Pillar 2, meanwhile, morphed into a global minimum tax. At a high level, other countries were trying to copy GILTI, but in the OECD's hands, the scope of the idea has grown. Now, if Pillar 2 was simply a platform for other countries to mimic GILTI, we wouldn't be here today. But 3 changes made between the 2021 agreement and the release of the OECD model rules turned the OECD minimum tax into a U.S. revenue loser. The first was that the UTPR, the undertax profits rule, provides other countries full rein to tax the domestic earnings of U.S. multinationals. Second, many U.S. general business credits, because they are not refundable, are treated as reducing taxes paid and increase the risk of a top-up tax being imposed. And third, Pillar 2 now encourages other countries to enact their own qualified domestic minimum taxes, QDMTTs. The details are complicated, but the principle is not. When other countries increase taxes on U.S. multinationals, the U.S. loses money because of the foreign tax credit. This is the landscape we face today. I'd like now to sketch out possibilities for fixing the deal to minimize its harmful impacts. One, the U.S. could modify its domestic rules so that they conform to Pillar 2, but this is unlikely to make up the revenues lost to other countries while also costing the U.S. fisc. Two, the U.S. could threaten other countries with retaliation, but this could have harmful impacts on cross-border trade. Three, the U.S. could encourage the OECD to modify some of the worst of its arbitrary rules. I think the guidance released earlier this week suggests that this is a viable path. And four, the OECD rules are based on financial accounting, but it's Congress, through the SEC, that retains the ultimate authority for the accounting guidelines followed by publicly traded companies. Over the longer term, the two-pillar agreement highlights a failure in Treasury's interaction with Congress when pursuing international tax negotiations. Congress could and should be providing Treasury with clearer guidance here. A model could be the Trade Promotion Authority, which guides the executive branch when it's pursuing and negotiating trade agreements. Thank you again for inviting me to testify. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Hertzfeld. Mr. Michel, you can start if you're ready.
Chairman Kelly, Mr. Hearn, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'll begin by describing how the OECD has abandoned its founding principles, then highlight the costs of the Biden administration's work with the OECD to overturn domestic tax laws, and conclude with how Congress should respond. Founded more than a century ago, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development was established to preserve individual liberty and increase well-being. It did this by expanding trade and international investment. An important part of this work was the OECD's role in coordinating international tax systems to reduce the double taxation of international income. In recent decades, the OECD has transformed into an unaccountable, taxpayer-funded special interest group for a government-centric economic policy model. This is a perversion of the principles on which it was founded. Through its project on base erosion and profit shifting, bureaucrats in Paris have abandoned the pretense of objectivity. They've done this as part of a multi-decade crusade against any country that dares use its tax code to compete for international business. Its most recent work has culminated in a two-pillar proposal that aims to take domestic sovereignty over tax law away from elected governments around the world, increase economically costly corporate tax rates, raise new revenue from primarily U.S. firms, and redistribute taxing rights away from productive economies to consumer economies. Pillar 1 is intended to replace extraterritorial digital services taxes targeted at the United States' most profitable and iconic digital brands. These taxes have been widely criticized on a bipartisan basis. Pillar 1's new digital tax isn't any better. It's designed to redistribute the profits of the largest American businesses to revenue-hungry governments across the world. Pillar 2's five-part 15% minimum tax is even worse. It includes a new extraterritorial levy that will allow other countries to reach into our borders and claim taxing rights over the U.S. domestic income of U.S.-based companies. Estimates indicate that Pillar 2 will reduce U.S. revenues by more than $120 billion, shrink domestic investment, and end hundreds of thousands of American jobs. Both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are bad deals for the United States. Every member on this dais, regardless of where you think ultimately our tax laws should end up, should be absolutely outraged at how the administration has used the OECD to circumvent your constitutional role in policymaking. By sidelining Congress, Treasury's negotiators have colluded with foreign powers to tax American businesses. They've done this after Congress, on a bipartisan basis, rejected the administration's preferred tax policies. So what can Congress do? First, Congress should instruct the President to immediately withdraw from the OECD convention and stop funding the close to 20% of the organization's budget we support. The OECD is not only bad on tax policy, its projects on inequality, labor markets, and climate pursue whole-of-government approaches which seek one-size-fits-all solutions, regularly calling for higher taxes, more redistribution, and greater government subsidies. It's a disgrace that American tax dollars are subsidizing an organization that is actively undermining American competitiveness abroad. Second, and even more importantly, after rejecting the OECD's tax increases, America needs to be the most attractive place to do business in the world. Building on the reforms in 2017, Congress should lower the corporate tax rate to the OECD and Biden administration agreed upon rate of 15% or lower, finish the transition to a full territorial international tax system, and make full expensing for all new U.S. business investments permanent. This would be the most powerful message Congress could send to the OECD. We should be playing the tax competition game they are trying to stop. Your leadership is ultimately necessary to protect American workers from a future dictated by policymakers in Europe, a future that would include higher taxes, slower growth, and fewer jobs. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Michel. Ms. Gordon, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the Tax Subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me today to testify about this critical issue. I'm the Vice President for International Tax Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council. NFTC is an association of U.S. business enterprises engaged in all aspects of international trade and investment. Our goal is to foster an environment in which U.S. companies can compete globally. On balance, the work of the inclusive framework fails in several respects, and in too many instances specifically harms the competitiveness of American businesses. The continued engagement of Congress is essential to creating stability and protecting American interests. First, let me briefly mention Pillar 1. The business community has repeatedly requested a final consultation on the overall Pillar 1 concept, as there are several major problematic issues still unresolved in both Amounts A and Amount B. There must be a cohesive, workable structure for tax administrations and taxpayers on all of Pillar 1, one that has the backing of Congress. At this juncture, we feel it would be premature for the U.S. to sign the Pillar 1 Multilateral Convention being released later this year. International tax is a complicated web of U.S. and foreign laws and bilateral income treaties, and Pillar 2 is adding to that. With the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act enacted in 2017 by Congress, there's a new international tax system that ensured the foreign operations of U.S. companies were subject to minimum tax under the first of its kind GILTI framework. And U.S. base erosion was prevented under the BEAT. In short, the United States is not now, nor has ever been, a tax haven. Moreover, the notion that additional foreign minimum taxes are needed to prevent the abusive use of the U.S. tax code is unfounded. The breadth of issues still remaining with the nearly complete Pillar 2 agreement is unsettling. The initial rules were created without sufficient and at times disregard of input from the business community. The final rules currently contain multiple flaws that will hurt investment in the United States. More than anything else, what we need is time. Time to create a cohesive set of rules that accommodate U.S. tax policies and ensure that U.S. businesses, U.S. workers, and the U.S. economy are not disproportionately harmed. The recently announced delay in the application of the Undertax Profits Rule, UTPR, is a step in the right direction and is unlikely to have occurred without the attention of Congress on this project. For many NFTC members, compliance with Pillar 2 is a looming reality, whether or not the United States makes any domestic law changes. The more compliant the existing U.S. tax system is deemed to be with Pillar 2 rules, the better the result for U.S. companies and workers. One such fix is the earlier global consensus that current law GILTI is a compliant income inclusion rule, or IIR. In designing the Pillar 2 minimum tax, non-refundable credits are disfavored, while refundable credits, more commonly used in other countries, and direct cash grants are favored. In short, the use of many bipartisan credits, such as the R&D credit, could reduce a corporation's tax rate below 15% and allow other countries to impose additional tax, effectively a clawback of U.S. tax credits. It is extremely troublesome that U.S. negotiators have not succeeded in broadly protecting U.S. credits, while other countries were given specific carve-outs for their incentives and industries. Even the acceptance of refundable credits merely adds them to the denominator of the ratio, which is tax paid over taxable income. This is helpful in many fact patterns, but it can still result in additional tax for those with significant investments, such as the energy credits. The new preferential treatment of transferable credits similar to that of refundable credits, is not without numerous complexities, which may result in limited practical utility. Above and beyond the policy concerns, the Pillar 2 tax return is unworkable and unadministrable compliance burden. It puts U.S. companies' sensitive financial information and competitive advantage at risk for disclosure or leaking to non-U.S. competitors. NFTC members have estimated the Pillar 2 returns, as envisioned, would provide anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 data points, which is far greater than the 1,000 data points estimated for the EU's country-by-country reporting. One goal of the Pillar 2 work was to provide tax certainty and reduce the number of tax disputes, but the opposite is more likely to occur. I do want to briefly mention the developing countries have expressed concern and dismay with the OECD inclusive framework, preferring the UN. Employing two competing processes or layering a UN regime over the OECD pillars would be disastrous. At this juncture, it appears U.S. companies and the U.S. FIS may lose whether or not the U.S. adopts a conforming Pillar 2 regime. However, the OECD has shown flexibility in interpreting and clarifying its rules, including the provision of numerous temporary safe harbors, with the one on the UTPR just this week. Congress's attention to this process has been helpful in obtaining this temporary relief. We urge Congress to continue working with the OECD, Treasury negotiators, and foreign counterparts to create a regime that works with the U.S. tax code, protects U.S. companies and workers from an unlevel playing field, and encourages investment and economic growth in the U.S. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gordon. Mr. Shives, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Sorry. Representative Hearn, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to this hearing. Our international tax system is famously complicated, but some things are simple, or at least they should be, and I'm here to make two simple points. First, in the United States, taxes must be imposed by Congress, not the President. Second, the tax policy of the United States should be set by the United States, not by other countries. Unfortunately, in joining the Pillar 2 agreement, which imposes a global minimum tax on large corporations, the Biden administration has strayed from both of these principles. Proceeding without congressional approval, they've given other countries significant influence over our tax system. So Congress is now under pressure to enact a global minimum tax that satisfies Pillar 2. Technically, the agreement doesn't compel it to do so, but there's a steep price for saying no. Other countries will be able to collect and keep this tax. So if a U.S. company like Apple uses a tax credit to cut tax on its U.S. income below 15%, France and Germany will be able to take away this tax savings, even though Congress meant to provide it. This puts Congress in a difficult position. The message essentially is, adopt a Pillar 2 minimum tax, or other jurisdictions will do it for you. This denies Congress the ability to make an independent choice. By analogy, think about a nonprofit that asks for a donation which is supposed to be voluntary, but then adds, if you don't give us the money, those big guys over there will take it from you. This pressure is all the more inappropriate because the U.S. already has 3 minimum taxes in place. In fact, we led the way in enacting them, but our minimum taxes don't satisfy the OECD. The Biden administration should have said that we would join Pillar 2 if and only if our minimum taxes were sufficient. Instead, the administration got out ahead of Congress, undercutting Congress's ability to make an independent choice about Pillar 2. This is not the way taxes are supposed to be imposed in this country. Under the Constitution, only Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes. This is an expression of a fundamental idea: no taxation without representation. The president can't just rewrite the tax law on his own. For example, the U.S. had one of the highest corporate tax rates in the world until Congress cut it from 35% to 21% 5 years ago. But if Congress had voted down this measure, could the Trump administration have done this on their own, announcing that they would collect only a 21% tax? Obviously not. The same is true for the Biden administration. The right way to change our minimum tax regimes is to appeal to Congress, or if they say no, to voters, not to an international organization. This brings me to my second point. Should we really give the OECD so much power? Unfortunately, the U.S. now has one set of minimum taxes, the OECD has another, and they aren't in sync. This pressures us to revise our rules to spare U.S. businesses from double taxation. According to the Joint Committee, as already been discussed, we also are going to lose a great deal of revenue. Some might call it unfair to blame the Biden administration for what other countries do. For example, if a U.S. multinational like Apple wants to do business in France, Apple chooses to be subject to whatever taxes France imposes on profits there. But let me emphasize on profits there. Pillar 2 does more than that. With the UTPR, France can collect tax from Apple's French subsidiary based not on the French subsidiary's income in France, but on the U.S. parent's income in the U.S. To see how aggressive this is, imagine that you live in Virginia and your daughter lives in California. Obviously, Virginia can tax you since that's where you live and earn money. But should California also be able to tax you and to do it through your daughter? Is it okay for California to tax your daughter based not on what she earns in California, but on what you earn in Virginia? This is what a UTPR does. When faced with this sort of overreach, the administration should push back and threaten retaliation, as the House has done. But in committing to Pillar 2, the administration essentially pledged not to object to this overreach. Arguably, they encouraged it. To sum up, the administration has empowered other countries to reshape our tax law while curtailing Congress's role. This is not the way our system is supposed to work. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shizer. Mr. Barnes, 5 minutes.
Representative Hearn, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of this committee, I appreciate this opportunity to speak on Pillar 2. This is a critically important proposal, and how the U.S. responds will have a major impact on our companies, their global competitiveness, and the U.S. fisc. Yes, Pillar 2 represents a significant change in international tax law, but it comes as the next step in decades of efforts to align international tax rules so that corporations can and will run their businesses based on market fundamentals, not taxes. The U.S. competes very successfully in that environment. The U.S. is the model for much of Pillar 2. Congress deserves credit for enacting GILTI, which demonstrated the soundness of ensuring corporate income earned outside the parent company's home jurisdiction is subject to a minimum tax. The reason the United States should join this initiative is quite simple. More than 100 countries will adopt Pillar 2 in their domestic laws. The proposal is not going to be abandoned. So the United States faces a choice: join this exercise or stand outside the process. The merits of joining are clear. First, the U.S. fisc is better served by joining Pillar 2. The revenue impact on the United States is uncertain, as detailed in the Joint Committee's analysis. But one conclusion from the JCT is clear. The U.S. will earn more tax revenue if it adopts the Pillar 2 agreement than if the U.S. stands aside while other countries proceed. Second, U.S. multinational companies will benefit. Compliance burdens will be reduced, and competitiveness will be improved. Today, U.S. companies are subject to our GILTI tax, but no other country has a similar regime. Competitor companies often pay little or no tax on low-taxed earnings of foreign subsidiaries. The global minimum tax will benefit U.S. companies by subjecting their competitors to a minimum 15% tax. The legislative changes required for conformity with Pillar 2 are modest. The Build Back Better legislation approved by this committee in the House of Representatives in 2022 included the changes to U.S. law required to align the U.S. with Pillar 2. The path forward is well marked. Much of the criticism of Pillar 2 has centered on the undertaxed profits rule. Critics argue that the UTPR violates tax sovereignty. This argument, in my view, misunderstands the concept of sovereignty. If a country adopts tax rules into its law, that's the quintessential exercise of tax sovereignty. Indeed, that's the argument the U.S. has made for 3 decades when countries object to the use of arbitration for dispute resolution under treaties. Countries complained that allowing arbitrators to decide a tax dispute was a denial of sovereignty. No, the U.S. responded repeatedly. When a sovereign adopts a rule such as tax arbitration, there's no loss of sovereignty because it's the decision of the sovereign to establish that procedure. The argument that Pillar 2 undermines U.S. tax sovereignty is not persuasive. More importantly, the UTPR is an important but diminishing feature of Pillar 2. If a country adopts the key elements of Pillar 2, there will be no undertaxed foreign income earned by that country's corporations subject to the UTPR. The UTPR safe harbor regarding home country income announced on Monday by the OECD eliminates, at least temporarily, the risk that other countries will tax income earned by U.S. companies from U.S. activities. Pillar 2 is the result of many compromises. Any informed critic can find elements of the proposal that need further work. Fortunately, discussions about the technical issues are still under debate. So far, the United States has had a full voice in those discussions. But there's a limit to what weight the U.S. interests will be given if the U.S. chooses to stand outside Pillar 2. The U.S. must join the initiative so that the U.S. voice will continue to be strong and effective in negotiating these rules. Some critics of Pillar 2 act as if the proposal can still be derailed. At last count, 138 countries indicated their intention to join. The choice facing the U.S. is binary: adopt the proposal or step away from the table with the attendant consequences. I urge this committee to align the U.S. tax rules with Pillar 2. That will continue our leadership in developing sound international tax practices that benefit our companies and their ability to drive economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. I'd like to thank each of the witnesses for your expert testimony, and we're going to now move into the question and answer session, and so I will recognize myself. The overall goal of Pillar 2 is to ensure that all companies are paying a minimum rate of 15% everywhere they operate. It makes no sense to me that non-refundable tax credits are treated worse than refundable tax credits in the OECD Pillar 2 rules. The OECD's whack-a-mole approach to eliminate tax competition is ill-considered. Ms. Hertzfeld, as you know, the Pillar 2 rules favor refundable tax credits. JCT finds that the effectiveness of Pillar 2 might be significantly weakened by the introduction of refundable tax credits by low-tax jurisdictions. The country that introduces them thereby preserves its fiscal competition feature without visibly having a low tax rate, end quote. Ms. Hertzfeld, do these rules that were just stated, do these rules eliminate tax competition or merely just create a new competition for direct pay, tax tradable subsidies?
Thank you for the question. Yes, they do. The latter part of your question, they shift tax competition to other areas. One is in the form of the type of tax incentives that countries could offer, and so countries can compete along the lines of credits that are blessed by the model rules. The other way they can compete are also noted by the Joint Committee. They can compete for in the substance-based income exclusion, so that allows an exclusion from the top-up tax, and so they can compete in that area as well.
And with that would come negotiations that would get you, as a company or in a country, you would negotiate that with a body like ours, supposedly, or something similar, to be able to get those. And it would be a competition much like it is today. It would be influence peddling and lobbying, and it'd be all of those combined, except in a different world. So it's the old saying, tell me the rules and I can play the game. Is that fair?
Correct, and also note that they, in addition to tax incentives, this encourages a shift to direct subsidies, and so there's lots of different ways that countries can and probably will compete to encourage investment in their jurisdictions.
So it'd be credits that would incentivize certain companies to possibly stay there and do business, and pick and choose winners and losers for in-country competition, one favoring one competitor over another, possibly. All these things come into play that would create a whole another set of rules that we'd have to put in place and look at. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is countries compete for investment, and if one avenue is shut down, then they'll likely move to another.
Do you see this creating, I think you've alluded to this, creating a sort of a whole new government free-for-all with added complexities and burdens that go along with that? I believe that's what you're saying.
So these rules squash certain types of investments, and so they will encourage other types of incentives to proliferate, which, yes, you've added complexity in shutting down one area, but taxpayers and businesses are always creative in trying to maximize their return on their investments in jurisdictions, and countries are creative in trying to encourage businesses to invest there.
Mr. Scheiser, if I may, I really appreciate your scenario of really bringing it down to what everybody can understand. In your example of Virginia, my colleague here said, yes, they would love for California to be able to tax everybody in every state for all. Really
No, I said your daughter.
Oh, my daughter in your state, even though she's never been there. Mr. Scheiser, can you go into detail how the OECD's favoring of certain credits over others can be problematic in the future as it relates to the sovereignty of this nation, and how the powers of this committee laid out in the Constitution could be usurped?
My apologies. Thank you for the question. Look, the Constitution is clear about this, that this is the prerogative of Congress, and this is a very old idea. We fought a revolution years ago because of concerns about a king in a distant parliament who weren't listening to American voices, and the Declaration of Independence emphasizes that taxes can't be imposed without representation. So it makes sense that revenue bills begin with you. They begin in the House because you're closest to the people. Now, it's true, the president does also partner with Congress in negotiating with foreign countries, but it is a partnership. When there are treaties, the president negotiates, proposes, but it's the Senate that needs to ratify. So we really don't want the president acting unilaterally. And I want to emphasize this is not and should not be a partisan point. Sometimes the president is a Democrat, sometimes the president is a Republican, and it should not be the case that a president can partner with an international organization to circumvent the will of Congress. And I'll just give an example, maybe points in the other direction. There's been talk about the energy credits that were passed last summer. If the next president doesn't like them and says, please repeal them, it'll be up to Congress to decide whether to do that. It should not be possible for the president to go to the OECD and say, hey, trigger a top-up tax to eliminate those because I don't like them. Now, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scheiser. I'm going to, one last question, and we'll move on to the ranking member. Ms. Hirschfeld, a few of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have made a push to modify the U.S. rules for taxing the foreign income of U.S. multinationals so that it is calculated on a jurisdictional basis, also known as country by country. As you know, this is the primary change to GILTI to come into conformity with Pillar 2. Would this modification change JCT's outlook for the U.S. fisc, meaning if the U.S. modified the GILTI rules to be compliant with the OECD brokered deal, has JCT estimated that U.S. will still lose billions of dollars in revenue?
So I don't have the details behind the Joint Committee's analysis, but it seems to me that the two primary factors that were driving the numbers that showed a loss of U.S. revenues were, one, the fact that if other countries enact new domestic minimum taxes to increase their tax rate to 15%, the U.S. has to provide a foreign tax credit for that. So that's an automatic revenue. So other countries increase their taxes, ours goes down. Country by country GILTI doesn't change that. And the other is the UTPR that imposes the tax on U.S. Domestic source income, and country by country GILTI doesn't change that either.
Thank you for your response. I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Barnes, we've heard quite a bit from our Republican colleagues on the topic of sovereignty and why they believe that the Pillar 2 agreement threatens the United States' sovereignty to enact tax laws. But isn't it true that each of the countries in the inclusive framework, including the United States of America, has the right to enact or not to enact domestic legislation that aligns with Pillar 2?
Thank you for the question. Yes, every country retains its authority, and it's an important point to note that there's not a one-size-fits-all. The OECD's agreement is trying to align the rules. It's not prescriptive to say you must do A, B, C, D, E. There's flexibility within the framework for how countries choose to adapt, and that's why modifying the U.S. GILTI rules may be sufficient for the U.S., even though another jurisdiction takes a different approach to aligning with the proposals under Pillar 2.
Thank you. And doesn't the fact that we're having this hearing today and the fact that the elected Biden administration has been negotiating with the OECD mean that we're not ceding our sovereignty?
Well, that certainly would be my view. Thank you. And again, I come back to what I said in the oral statement, which is in arbitration for tax disputes, other governments have said, that's a loss of my sovereignty, and the U.S. has said, no. You, as the sovereign, can choose to have certain disputes settled by arbitration, and that does not impede your sovereignty one bit.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barnes, again, many of my colleagues across the aisle seem to think the U.S. should abandon these OECD negotiations. As a matter of fact, one of the witnesses mentioned that too. I mentioned to the chairman that, that old saying that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that might hold true here as well. In your view, which would be better for American businesses and American workers? Remaining at the table to ensure a fair outcome, or walking away from the table entirely?
Well, I'm a huge believer that we need to be at the table and our voices heard. One thing that's important, and I spent 4.5 years at the Treasury Department, one thing that's important to remember is that our voice is widely respected within the world. We've been a leader in developing international tax principles for a century, and our voice is heard. But if we walk away from Pillar 2, then our concerns will not be taken into account with nearly the same weight as if we're a player in the exercise.
Thank you. And thank you for pointing out the time you spent at Treasury. I think we have a very unique witness in you, Mr. Barnes. The fact that you've been at Treasury, you've been a player in negotiations such as these, you've been in the private sector, and you've been a tax consultant to many major corporations and entities. I think you bring a lot of expertise to the witness dais today. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Hurstfield, I'm going to start with you. You may have been here and you may have heard Mr. Plowgen telling us that our treaties allow us to tax income earned outside its borders. And he cited the example of CFCs. Do you think that this is accurate?
So our CFC regime, which is known as Subpart F, has been in place since 1962, and it's widely accepted that treaties allow for taxation of foreign earned income by CFCs. Subpart F, and that's what GILTI does also. There's a big difference between Subpart F and GILTI and the taxing provisions of the UTPR, which allow for extraterritorial taxation in a way that violates existing treaty principles. And so there's, although the U.S. laws that are in place are consistent with treaties, the UTPR is much more questionable.
So it's that, in your opinion, that would lead to less stability in international tax administration and probably lead to disputes with our trading and taxing partners.
I think there are big open questions about whether the UTPR is consistent with existing tax treaties. Several European academics have recently written a long article explaining why they think it's not consistent with treaties, and so I don't know what happens when you have a lot of countries enacting a law that conflicts with their existing tax treaties.
And we should certainly be having communication with the Treasury Secretary and the administration, sharing work product, and this committee should be at the forefront of determining that. Moving on, Mr. Scheisser, if I heard you right, we're talking about refundable credits. If a company here in the U.S. has $300 million of taxable income, 400 million, $1 billion, whatever the number is, and then they decide that they are going to take advantage of the green energy tax credits, and they take advantage of 300 million of those, and they effectively drive their tax rate here in the U.S. down to zero. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if that happens, then a European country could say, well, you have an effective tax rate of 0, therefore we're going to tax an additional 15% to bring you up, right?
That is the risk I was identifying, yes.
So let's just think about this for 1 second. So the corporations that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in this administration have railed against about paying their fair share, in this example would go from $300 million of taxable income to 0, and then we're going to take 15% of their of that, and then we're going to give it to somebody in France or Italy or Germany or wherever.
So the OECD has given a bit of guidance, giving comfort on this, but I can tell you as someone who's practiced tax law for 30 years, we've never heard the last word on anything. If they wanted to change the guidance tomorrow, there's a risk that those credits become ineffective because all of a sudden France is nullifying them with a tax.
Okay. So we're not collecting tax revenue here and we're giving tax revenue to a foreign country.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Michel, I've heard a witness say here that we are faced with what I believe is a false choice, which is either join in the discussions or be left on the sidelines. We are America. We're the world's #1 economy, the #1 place to innovate. We have the most productive workforce. We are in a unique spot. Instead of our voices being heard, shouldn't our policies dictate, and shouldn't we be putting America in a place of leading the world, not simply following behind it?
Thank you for the question. I do believe that America should be setting the tax policy that's right for us and is growing our economy and helping American workers here in the United States. The way we do that is keeping our taxes low, setting policies that encourage innovation and investment. We have been at the table as part of the ongoing process, and you can see where it's gotten us. The U.S. fisc is about to lose hundreds of billions of dollars. Investment in the United States is projected to go down. And members up and down the dais here were just pleading with a representative from Treasury to make sure that companies can still access tax credits that you all put into place.
One more quick question for Ms. Gordon. Ms. Gordon, at the end of the day, American business counts. It counts because it provides jobs for American workers. Do you see this creating more jobs or taking away jobs from America?
As currently envisioned, it seems to reduce the number of jobs in the United States.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett.
Thank you very much. Mr. Michel, though you and I have very significant disagreements about most everything you testified to, one thing that I do want to say is that you're to be commended for your candor in your testimony, and particularly that portion of your written testimony that you indicate that eliminating corporate taxes is a worthy goal, because I think that's exactly what these folks have been trying to do. They reduced the corporate tax rate by 60% in 2017, and of course, for those multinationals that have stashed so much money down in the Cayman Islands, $60 billion in 1 year, and are only paying 0.6% in taxes, they've gotten very close to your goal of just eliminating corporate taxation on those monies. And defending this kind of system assures that we'll have more of the same kind of tax scam. And Mr. Barnes, I want to ask you about some of the arguments that I've heard from my colleagues. One of them has been, well, why didn't the Treasury Department just go over there to Europe and get exempt every tax credit that we have? Don't you suppose, Mr. Barnes, that if we ask for that every other country would ask to have every credit and preference and loophole in their tax code exempted as well, so that the idea of a minimum tax and stopping the race to the bottom would be totally meaningless?
Well, thank you. I suspect everyone in this room has been involved in negotiations. In tax negotiations, whether it's tax treaties or a negotiation like this Pillar 1, Pillar 2 exercise, every country comes with its sovereign interests, and the idea that the U.S. can completely bully its way through is, I think, a false optimism. Yes, we have a lot of authority, But if our take it or leave it is all of our stuff is good, other countries are going to insist on the same approach.
We can't just be a go it alone if we want to be a true leader in the world. And the other argument that they make is, well, we've got this guilty tax. Why didn't they just go over and get it accepted and approved? And I know that some negotiations are still continuing, but the guilty tax has a few loopholes in it. One of them is that they blend the country by country instead of defining the results country by country, and that allows for a great deal of subversion from the whole idea of a minimum tax. What's your feeling about the failure to just totally exempt guilty as it exists today? The same guilty, by the way, which, as I pointed out from the joint tax analysis, those are the 88 multinationals that are now paying under 8% as their tax rate.
Well, it's important to recognize that the guilty tax paid by U.S. corporate taxpayers is counted in the calculation toward the global minimum tax. So it's not like the guilty tax is on top of the global minimum tax. It simply has not yet been deemed sufficient to eliminate any need to compete and comply with the minimum tax.
In your opinion, would the adoption of a global minimum tax, the Treasury has been advocating what's called Pillar 2, would it diminish the competitiveness of U.S. businesses?
I think the answer is no, and I realize I may be an outlier here, but let me give a concrete example. A U.S. company invests in a low-tax jurisdiction, Switzerland, Singapore, a real business, $500 million, 1,000 very skilled workers. Because of Singapore's tax incentives, there's zero tax. A Singapore-owned Singapore company pays zero. A Dutch-owned Singapore company pays zero. A U.S.-owned Singapore company pays 10.5% under guilty. That's our rules today. The U.S. company is handicapped by 10.5 percentage points. A global minimum tax may cause the U.S. company in Singapore to pay a little more tax, but it will bring up the tax for the Singaporean-owned Singapore company and the Dutch-owned Singapore company to 15%. In that environment, I'm quite confident the U.S. company's subsidiary in Singapore will be very successful.
Well, thank you for your example. Just overall, if we set a reasonable minimum on taxation, we would be competing with other countries not on whether we could have a race to the bottom with the lowest possible taxes, but on things like education, our justice system, our workforce, our ability to do research and development here, and I think the United States would lead that competition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Chairman, Acting Chairman, or Chairman. And thank you to the panelists for being here today. It's important that we talk through this issue. Just as we saw with the previous panel, the Treasury Department's willfully ignoring the reality by working around Congress, working around the committee, and trying to pave the way for new taxes to these deals with the OECD that are fundamentally un-American and would give away our tax base to foreign countries. Throughout the process of the OECD base erosion and profit shifting, the BEPS 2.0 negotiation, administration has repeatedly made commitments that are out of its prerogative to both make and fulfill. Treasury has cut Congress out of the process, even though constitutionally only Congress can write tax laws and commit the United States to the end deal negotiated at OECD. And why is the administration repeatedly ignoring the requests of the committee and dumbing down on the efforts to give away American tax base? It's all to ram down this bad anti-American policy. At virtually every step of the negotiation process, the administration's chosen America last. The deal's so terrible, I have to ask which country's interests the Biden administration negotiated for. Because it doesn't seem to be the interests of America that the Treasury's negotiated for. As a result of Pillar 2, if we followed UTPR, the U.S. Treasury would get less tax revenue, U.S. businesses will pay more in taxes, U.S. businesses will have more administrative cost and work effort to increase. U.S. taxpayers will not have credit for the current tax code provisions that they have to comply with. And it incentivizes businesses, whether they're located in U.S. or businesses located in other tax countries, to look for the lowest tax district because they will not have to pay the global minimum in addition to what they're already paying. And we've already put the big effort in getting away from inversions with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we passed 5 years ago. The concessions during the Pillar 2 negotiations will result in U.S. companies paying more tax overall, but less to the United States. As the Joint Committee Taxation identified, the U.S. will lose roughly $120 billion in tax revenue if Pillar 2 is adopted globally, but we don't change our tax code, and we'll still lose $60 billion if we do adopt the OECD Pillar 2. And furthermore, our share of global gross domestic product is 24%, while U.S. countries' share is 40% of the income exposed to the higher taxes. Further evidence that the deal disappropriately affects the United States. Ms. Hertzfield, can you explain how such a scheme would benefit the United States? I mean, are there anything in the deal that benefits us in exchange for what we're giving away?
Thank you. I personally have trouble seeing the benefit, and I'm often asked the question from people from other countries why the U.S. Negotiated this deal.
You know, this week, OECD announced delays in implementation of one of the Pillar 2's most harmful provisions, one that I think is really the problem, the under-taxed profits rule. But this delay is not a fundamental change in this bad policy and only extends this uncertainty companies are facing. Ms. Gordon, what are the main concerns you hear from companies about complying with these new rules? What's the response you're hearing about the delay in implementation?
Congressman, thank you for your question. So our members welcome the delay, but as you mentioned, it's not a change in policy. And some of the concerns are, even with the UTPR safe harbor, that only applies to the United States. So most multinationals have entities in other countries as well. And if they are in Ireland, where there's a lot of U.S. investment, the UTPR safe harbor will not count on that income in Ireland, for instance.
So it's problematic. I mean, and from my point of view, is if it's a bad policy, it's a bad policy next year. It's a bad policy 2 years later. It's just a bad policy, and that's not what we should implement. I'm really concerned about this policy. I'm really concerned about UTPR. I mean, as JCT confirmed, that the United States will lose less if we're forced to implement the OECD Pillar 2 provisions. It's not that we're going to gain more. And the fact that UTPR and Pillar 2 is not really a volunteer tax sovereignty. I mean, if you want to consider extortionary threats of you either change your tax code or you pay this higher rate anyway. So for that provisions, I'm really concerned about this process. Really, we need to fix the bad policy before it gets implemented ever. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'd now like to recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson.
Connecticut, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank all the panelists. This has been a very interesting session. We don't often spend as much time on the Constitution as we have today, and I'm quite interested in the constitutionality of all this. I actually thought we were in a committee hearing in the United States Congress actually discussing in the Committee of Cognizance tax policy and discussing the ramifications of that policy. So rather than working around, I kind of feel like this is working directly. And the way that our system works, 4 witnesses come with very important and well-established, well-researched views on their feelings, and one is a counterbalance to all of that. For those that are listening in on this, that's how the system works. That's how it's supposed to work. So, Mr. Barnes, I had to ask you, especially, you seem to have a difference of opinion about Pillar 2. Number one, do you think that the Constitution is being violated here by the Biden administration or here in Congress?
Well, because any tax legislation to enact Pillar 2 will necessarily be started in the House Ways and Means, will go to the Senate, will be signed by the President. It will follow our ordinary course of constitutional progress for tax legislation at the end of the day.
That was my impression, and I used to be a history teacher in school, so I thought that we were following the Constitution. You can have constitutional concerns, but we are following the Constitution. Also, there's big disagreement over whether or not the future for this great nation of ours, in these joint agreements with more than 50 countries that are participating in this, it seems as though we should be going it alone as opposed to working with other nations in a global economy, and in these times where we're in a world that where we need to be at the table, seated there, and it seems as though we're saying, no, what we need to do is operate alone and by ourselves. That to me sounds an awful lot like isolationism. How are we advantaged by working together with these other nations, Mr. Barnes?
Let me take two examples from tax history that are not directly Pillar 2. First would be the treatment of corporate bribes. Some of you are familiar with the history. In the 1970s, the U.S. said corporate bribes are bad, they should not be tax deductible. Other countries were, that's an ordinary cost of doing business. It took 20 years before some of our major trading partners said bribes are not a good thing, we should make them non-tax deductible and illegal. The U.S. leadership took decades, but we got the right result. Same thing with bank secrecy. A tax system can only be enforced if there's adequate information. There were countries that said bank secrecy is part of our blood. You shouldn't come in and breach my bank secrecy. The U.S., with the help of Germany and a few other countries, over a period of time led to sufficient information exchange to enforce our laws. I think U.S. leadership consistently has helped improve global tax rules, and I am confident they did on Monday of this week, and the continued participation by the U.S. will make the ultimate Pillar 2 rules much, much better.
And how will that advantage the United States long run in terms of our economy?
I hope it will help us. I realize that there are debates over whether Pillar 2 ought to exist at all or not, but there's some distinct advantages. I mentioned one with the Singapore example to level the playing field. It will put pressure on countries to reduce their corporate tax rates. Those people who believe that high corporate tax rates, that is way above 15%, are a deterrent to investment should cheer Pillar 2. With a country-by-country analysis, a country like India, Japan, with high corporate taxes, will be starkly illustrated as having a rate where the taxpayers bear an excess cost. Today, with the blended rules under GILTI, that pressure doesn't fall entirely on the high-tax jurisdictions because taxpayers can self-help to a lower rate. The other advantage for the U.S. is one Michael Plowgen mentioned, which is it will reduce the incentives for U.S. businesses to move offshore. That has an advantage for investment in the U.S., U.S. workers, U.S. jobs.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Costello.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses for appearing today. Ms. Gordon, could I go back to you and follow up maybe a little bit on what Mr. Estes asked you? In your written testimony, and this is about compliance, you talked about how businesses are establishing systems right now to try to comply with Pillar 2's extensive reporting requirements. And in your testimony, you noted that one NFTC member has already spent a lot of money, I think you said 8 figures, and 15,000 hours preparing for those Pillar 2 requirements. Can you talk more about the compliance burdens that Pillar 2 will impose on U.S. businesses? What type of information are they going to have to submit, and what are some of the more unique challenges?
Congressman, thank you for your question. So our members have started to update their systems and prepare for compliance with Pillar 2 One member has noted they hired another 6 to 8 people. They have spent 15,000 hours preparing for this and over $10 million. Other members have noted that the $10 million is probably just the startup costs to implement these systems. So this is very labor intense, and that is really before we even have all of the rules and before we can see if all the countries enact the exact same rules or if there are slight differences. Every time there's a difference, that is more compliance costs, that is more time, and additional numbers that the country is going to need to, or the company is going to need to report to a different country.
And you may have just talked about this. What about the manpower? What about the labor that goes into that?
Yeah, there is a lot of labor. A lot of these numbers that the Pillar 2 tax return, the global information return, is requesting are not numbers that my members currently compute. So it's trying to get that information and compute these new numbers because they're on the return, not because they're used to assess the audit risk or because they're actually needed to compute either the IIR or the UTPR.
Thank you very much. Sarsfield, if I can, with you, you wrote a column in Tax Notes a couple of months ago in May. You talked about the risks associated with China participating in Pillar 2. Can you expound on that a little bit more? And could China cheat as it relates to their requirements?
Yeah, so it's, and thank you for that question. It's interesting that China in public has been mostly silent on its intentions. So Pillar 2 is not mandatory for any country to adopt. It's voluntary. And for complex reasons, it's not clear, although the UTPR is supposed to be this mechanism by which other countries are kind of forced into the system or else it will impose costs. Many large Chinese companies are actually not Chinese headquartered, they're Cayman headquartered, and so it's not clear really how effective the mechanisms that were designed for Pillar 2 would be in impacting Chinese companies. On Pillar 1, they've also been pretty silent, but I don't know what mechanisms there are for ensuring compliance in China that haven't been so effective in other areas, and so I thought it was interesting that there was no answer to the question about whether Secretary Yellen got a commitment from China on implementation of this deal.
So I'm going to ask this very politely. Are there challenges, or would there be challenges to monitoring China's compliance?
So we don't know anything right now about that. It's the OECD that would be designing a mechanism to ensure countries' compliance with this deal, and there's simply no, not even detailed. There's no information at all about how that would be, and so whether that could be effective, I think, is unknown at this point.
Fair to say that China could use strategies to try to circumvent the Pillar 2 rules?
There's lots of mechanisms countries could use, but yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barnes, one thing that struck me about your testimony was your statement that joining Pillar 2 will strongly benefit U.S. headquartered companies. Pardon me. From hearing my colleagues on the other side of the aisle discuss the global minimum tax, you would think that the sky was falling. In fact, I think my Republican colleagues sometimes are simply panic merchants, just trying to throw everybody into a panic, claiming that calamity is going to strike if we try to enact policies that make wealthy and well-connected multinational businesses pay their fair share in taxes. And someone on the other side actually said, what is their fair share? And I would just submit that when you have huge multinational corporations that make billions of dollars in profit and they're paying less than 1% in taxes, we might want to start at least with what individuals pay, because in the United States, individuals pay minimally 10%, but up to 37%, with most Americans paying between 12 and 32% in taxes. So that would just be kind of a starting point for fairness, I would think, especially when you think about the fact that these multinational corporations often use our court systems when they have business disputes. They rely on our firefighters and police when emergencies arise, and on our national security, and yet they move their profits overseas to low-tax countries to avoid paying into these same systems that they all use and all rely on. That doesn't seem to me to be a very pro-American way to operate, to take and take and take from the system and to never pay their fair share into it. So could you elaborate why signing on to the global minimum tax will strongly benefit our domestic businesses? I'm interested in hearing again why it makes sense for us to go with this regime.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Let me make two comments preliminarily. First, no corporation likes to pay $1 more than it's required to pay by the law. And that's why corporations have tax professionals like me to try to make sure they're fully compliant but not paying more than that. The second point is, I think what's critical here is that the U.S. companies are very capable of competing when the field is fair. And the minimum tax, in my view, helps ensure a fair field. We already have the GILTI rules. Other jurisdictions don't. There's what's called a participation exemption is the way many countries operate, and so they simply exempt the foreign earnings of their domestic companies. And indeed, one of our colleagues here on the panel has urged territoriality for the U.S. So why do I think it'll help the U.S. to have this rule? First, compliance. The U.S. compliance demands are extraordinarily difficult. I appreciate the comment about the challenges of the Globee return. If the U.S. is inside the tent, that is, if the U.S. is compliant with Pillar 2, then various safe harbors and other issues can be discussed in a way to reduce the compliance burden. U.S. companies will be subject to Pillar 2 regardless of what we do because 130 other countries will adopt it. I think we will substantially reduce the compliance burden. The second is the competitiveness point. We pay GILTI. Other countries don't have a GILTI, and whether the rate is 5%, 10%, 15%, 40%, the point would be to have a rate in which the U.S. companies are not disadvantaged, and where there's a level playing field, I think U.S. companies win.
Okay, and given that that's the case, do you have any theories about why these businesses aren't banging down Congress's door demanding that we sign on to Pillar 2?
I do have theories, but I'm happy to also yield to my colleagues. I think there are two reasons. One is it is absolutely out of character for a corporation to say, raise my taxes. That goes against everything the corporation has stood for and lived for. And to stand up now and say, we think increasing taxes on corporations is favorable is just completely antithetical to what corporations are all about. The second reason, I think, is a belief, which I don't share, a belief that the U.S. GILTI regime will be declared fully compliant, so the U.S. has nothing else it needs to do. The U.S. GILTI rate will increase in 2 years, as many of you know. We'll still have the blending, but I think corporations are optimistic, I believe incorrectly, but are optimistic that the U.S. GILTI rule will be declared compliant.
Thank you so much for your testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you, Gentlelady. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to say thank you to each of our witnesses today. In absence of the consultation by the Treasury, we relied on your analysis by those like you to understand this agreement that's being put before us. And just a quick, simple 101 economics tax lesson. Individuals and families pay tax, but they don't make goods and services. So they can't pass down the cost of tax, right? They just have to pay it. In corporations, and I'm talking to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, on corporations, when you increase their tax, what happens? They pass it down through their goods and services. So goods and services increase, causing inflation, causing the issues that we're currently in. That's actually called Economics 101. I just want you to know, these processes and agreements that are what we are seeing is when you pursue a partisan domestic tax agenda in an international tax forum. It really is. Ms. Hertzfeld, you pointed out in your article that the two largest benefactors in terms of revenue were Canada and Germany, and yet we saw that Canada declined to sign the recent Pillar 1 agreement, and Germany is now taxing IP under Section 49 of its tax code in what appears to be purely a revenue grab from U.S. firms. So despite being the largest benefactor of Pillar 2, they're moving forward with discriminatory taxes against American businesses. At the same time, these new rules may violate U.S. tax treaties. So my understanding was that these agreements were intended to stabilize the international tax code. But in essence, am I fair to say that they could and seems to be could realize that they are destabilizing our code? Could that actually happen?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I think there is a question about whether the promises about stability that this international agreement is supposed to bring will actually come to fruition. In addition to the examples you provided, there's also the example of Australia that has proposed a tax that's outside the scope of what was agreed to. And so all of those examples show that, raise questions about the promises of stability that the agreement was supposed to bring.
Thank you. Michael, you noted that also. Can you just note just 20 seconds on that?
The beginning of this project process started when France and other European unions started with digital services taxes. So I think the entire project starts with the assumption that you can agitate at the international level by putting these unilateral measures on other countries. And so that in and of itself tells you that this system is unstable.
Thank
and
you.
We're going to continue to see these types of unilateral actions as people agitate.
Exactly. Thanks for that.
Changes.
Thanks for stating that, because every country is different. We're going to destabilize the international tax system by going down this path. Ms. Gordon, it's good to see you again. I'm glad you're here. The NFTC's members include U.S. businesses that have been impacted by this agreement, many of whom provided comments throughout this negotiating process. And some of these comments, a large part of the comments, were a lot about proprietary information that they will have to give up. You know, it sounds like there could be over 200 data points that they've got to do compared to guilty where you have around 14 to 16, somewhere in there. I mean, this seems very egregious and makes it very uncompetitive to us when we have to give up all our proprietary information to the international code. Can you comment on that?
Congressman, thank you for your question, and great seeing you as well. Yes, so the numbers of 50,000 to 200,000 come from multiplying the number 200 versus 16 by all the entities. And yes, so taking all of that data and giving it to countries around the world who do not have the same protections for taxpayer information like the United States is a threat to American businesses. And many of these countries will either share it with state-run enterprises or local competitors and get tax advantages or details and knowledge of how these U.S. companies operate around the world, which is not helpful.
Yep, thank you. I agree 100%. Real quickly, Mr. Scheiser, I read your journal piece. I loved it, by the way. And you noted just what I said about Economics 101 is when you increase corporate tax, it affects the workers, it affects jobs, opportunities, economic growth. So can you explain why that is? I mean, just a basic Economics 101 that you wrote in your journal piece?
My apologies. Thank you for the question. I do think there is a misunderstanding in the general public about who pays the corporate tax. It could be that investors pay some of it, but it is very clear that consumers pay some and that workers pay a lot. And so when we talk about who should pay it, we have to remember that.
Thank you. You just made my point. I yield back.
Well, thank the gentleman. I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Delbene.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all our witnesses for joining us today. I appreciate it. Mr. Barnes, former President Trump once said it's easy to win a trade war. We all know that's not true, but it seems like our colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to open up a new front in this war by introducing a bill that would certainly wage a tax war. Just this morning, the Republicans introduced yet another retaliation proposal intended to punish our trading partners. And so, Mr. Barnes, I was wondering, are you aware of any tax wars that have been waged in the past? And in your judgment, is it easy to win a tax war?
Thank you for the question. It certainly is not easy to win a tax war. Let me mention a couple of examples. It's more frequent that the war is waged through administrative measures than through legislation, because it's rare to have legislation that targets one country or two countries. But administratively, it happens quite often. In the 1990s, Korea was administering their tax treaties and their tax laws in a way that went way beyond the words of the statutes and of their authority. When Korea wanted to join the OECD in the 1990s, the OECD, the US, and other countries said, no, you cannot join unless you go back and begin to follow the rules, the written rules, as you agreed to them in your tax treaties. And Korea agreed and has done so and joined the OECD. The most amusing one is probably the effort by India to attack the companies that have invested in India in call centers, 10,000 person, 20,000 person call centers. India has been extraordinarily aggressive. This was particularly in the early 2000s in taxing, one would say overtaxing, the foreign investors, including U.S. investors in the call centers. The Philippines government, in a tongue-in-cheek but very heartfelt letter that was published on the front page of the newspaper in India, said, thank you, India, for attacking these taxpayers. You are the best message for why investors should come to us in the Philippines. And it was, in fact, part of the reason that Philippines grew as a center for call centers. So I think when there have been inappropriate administration of taxes, rarely by legislation, more often by administration, it has generally backfired and reduced investment.
Thank you. It's my understanding that based on the JCT provided data, when you look at all of the U.S. employees of firms that are based in countries that are jurisdictions targeted by the chairman's bill, you get 8.9 million employees. So the Republican bill would place 8.9 million U.S. jobs at risk. That's not to suggest that UTPR is necessarily good tax policy or there aren't legitimate concerns about it. However, it seems that starting a tax war and putting at risk millions of U.S. jobs is not the right answer. I wondered, Mr. Barnes, in your professional opinion, what's the best way for the United States to move forward so as to make the UTPR less of a concern?
I think the short-term fix on Monday sets a path going forward. There are countries that I think we can agree are, I'll call them full tax, not necessarily high tax countries, but full tax countries. And I think we could either push for, maybe successfully, maybe not, push for a situation in which certain countries are acknowledged as full tax countries and the UTPR need not apply. The other would be a mechanical calculation. Find ways in which a taxpayer who, because of credits or other reasons, is below 15% this year, but over a 3-year average or 5-year average, they pay reasonable taxes. They may be exempt from the UTPR. I think if the U.S. is at the table, then creative tax negotiators can come up with approaches that would fully protect U.S. tax on U.S. income. But we need to be at the table for those negotiations to be successful.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Moore from Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to thank this entire second panel. This is just like being in graduate school here. I want to just say to my Republican colleagues that a lot of things that you are raising about the treatment of our tax credits, about how data will be used, are really legitimate things to raise. But you can't raise them if you ain't there at the table. And as many of you have discussed and our witnesses have discussed, just last week, we won one of those arguments by saying that tax credits that are transferable can be treated that way. We got to stay in the fray in order to benefit from it. We have heard many of our, and I agree with you, Mr. Barnes, I've never seen a corporation that doesn't want you to raise 1 penny extra in taxes. I think that this entire panel and all of our colleagues on the other side have forgotten that we just lowered the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 21%. And we still hear this, plaintive cry about how we just are taxing them to death. I also want to say that because of the way that the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was written up very quickly, that the 10.5 GILTI tax is actually at about 13%, given the lack of consideration about how that would interplay with other deductions and so forth that were not allowable. Am I correct so far, Mr. Barnes?
You're fully correct. Thank you.
And I also want to say that if we had just kept that 35% corporate tax rate, that would have been so much easier for the United States to have complied with the globe regimen, and we didn't do that. So I just want some of the whining, some of it to stop. Mr. Barnes, we have heard testimony here today about just how, and I've been hearing this for my entire professional life, about how adding or changing any sort of tax regimen creates all of this compliance and bureaucracy, and all of our graduate schools from the Wharton School aren't going to be able to figure this out. Even if they go to Duke, they can't figure out how to do it. Can you please give us a comparison of how not joining this global regimen, what the compliance problems will be versus if we join?
Thank you very much. The core problem is that the U.S. tax return, our GILTI regime, operate on what's known as tax accounting principles. And that is because our tax law, as developed by Ways and Means and everyone else, has special provisions for how you go from your income received in the door to a tax number. Under the GILTI regime, our companies will continue to need to use tax accounting to compute the U.S. GILTI liability. Under Pillar 2, there will be calculations based primarily on financial accounting. That's a different regime. In the U.S., that's GAAP. Outside the U.S., it's IFRS. And interestingly, there's no such thing as IFRS. Every country has their own IFRS. So U.S. companies, if the U.S. does not join the Pillar 2 exercise, will go through the full tax accounting world for GILTI calculations, plus the full financial accounting world calculations for
So it'll be harder, is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
It'll be worse. I went to Canada recently, and, one of my hosts said, I just don't, Fahrenheit and Celsius, you guys are just stupid. You're the only people in the world who do that. I just wanted to ask a question about this example we were given about the poor little daughter, that doesn't cash app her parent like most of them do, but is getting taxed. I just didn't think that was I was just trying to process that. It's just not an example of what you're talking about when we start talking about, can you give a better example than that? Because I think that one doesn't work. There's absolutely no tax liability on the daughter. She's more likely asking for cash app.
This may be satisfying or may not. Let me try. I would go back to a comment Michael Plowgen said, which is that the U.S. today, under Subpart F and GILTI, will tax a U.S. company on earnings in Singapore. So to use my example before, the Singapore government says, U.S. company, invest in Singapore, we're going to give you all these incentives, you will pay no tax. The U.S. says, great, fine, terrific, but we have a GILTI tax, so we're going to collect 10.5%. The Singapore government may not like it because we've undercut the value of their tax incentives, but that is absolutely consistent with international tax law.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I just didn't want that California daughter to get too worried.
No problem.
Or the Virginia dad, rather.
I now recognize Mr. Schneider from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here today. And Mr. Barnes, I want to pick up on your Singapore example since you brought it up. From a business standpoint, the three businesses you mentioned, Singapore business, zero tax, a Dutch business, zero tax, but the U.S. business in Singapore, 10.5% tax. What's the strategic business impact of that disparity?
Well, because of the U.S. rules, because of GILTI and our foreign tax credit and our Subpart F rules, you're always going to be taxed in the U.S. So I think the issue that comes up goes all the way back to the base erosion profit shifting. If the U.S. company has a choice between high-taxed India, lower-taxed Singapore, they are inclined to go to Singapore, all other things being equal. Now, rarely is everything else equal, but let's assume everything else is equal, because the lower taxes in Singapore will help you blend down the high taxes in India.
Got it. Let me turn to Mr. Scheiser for a second, because I know we've all shared the concerns about sovereignty. What's the population of the Cayman Islands?
I do not know.
I'll tell you, it's 69,000. How many companies, corporations are registered in the Cayman Islands?
Many companies.
116,000, more than the people in the Cayman Islands. Why do you think that is?
Low tax.
No tax, right? Zero, correct?
There are some costs, but yes.
The tax is zero. What is the implications for U.S. sovereignty with Cayman Islands zero tax?
I think the answer to that question depends on how the U.S. approaches income earned in the Cayman Islands.
I think it's zero. It's up to us to make our decisions, and we make choices on how we tax those companies. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay. What is the impact on U.S. revenues for those hundreds of thousands or 100,000 companies registering in the Cayman Islands?
Again, it depends.
It does?
Yes. If we wanted to tax it, we tax it. But if your point is it's an effort to try to reduce the U.S. tax base, that's true.
It does. In fact, that's BEPS. Mr. Barnes, isn't that the definition of BEPS?
It is. I would always say, though, you have to look at what the substance is in the Caymans. Is there substance or is there no substance?
That's a fair point. But isn't the goal of what we're doing here, talking about changing the tax regime, trying to eliminate those tax havens that get companies to register in the countries where they're actually doing business?
I'm sorry, you asked
Mr. Barnes. Mr. Barnes.
Sorry.
I think the key of what we're trying to do here is to take tax out of the equation as much as possible. We can't eliminate it completely, but let's get to business fundamentals. Where are your customers? Where are your talented workforce? Where's your economic inputs?
So if there's a level playing field, all things being equal, whether you want to say it in Latin or English, is it, in your opinion, do you think it's to the advantage of the United States because of our court systems, because of our universities, because of our workforce, of all of those things, in a level playing field, would companies be inclined to at least look at setting up shop here in the United States?
They would. I think you have two things. You have a reduced incentive to move out of the U.S., and you have an improved incentive to move back to the U.S. or to expand in the U.S. instead of expand elsewhere.
And if we do nothing and the rest of the world moves forward, do we lose, to some degree, the incentive for those companies that are moving profits from previously tax haven in countries to other countries? Are they likely to not come to the United States as much as they would go to the other G7 countries?
I think those companies would look at the complexity of complying with the U.S. rules and the Pillar 2 rules around the world and be daunted.
On the other hand, if the United States goes to the table, works to influence, as others have said, we should be at the table, influence the United States. I think it was Mr. Michael, you said this. We should be exercising the power of our influence. And Mr. Barnes, you said the rest of the world listens to the United States. Aren't we better served by being at the table and helping set the course of future tax structures in the world?
That's certainly my view, yes.
Okay. With that, I yield back.
I now recognize Ms. Miller from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today. It's of the utmost importance that we stop the OECD's forced march to socialism. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to our expert witnesses here today on how the Biden administration has failed the American people and attempted to abdicate key congressional responsibilities to unelected global bureaucrats who do not have our best interest in their heart in the slightest. If the administration fails to stand up for our workers and taxpayers, then everyone else in the world will be much more happy at eating our lunch while we're standing there with nothing. Ms. Hertzfield, have experts warned the UTPRs may violate the terms of bilateral tax treaties?
Yes, they have.
Could you describe just how foreign governments could tax U.S.-based companies under UTPR?
So the UTPR is a complicated rule, but what it does is it looks at every company multinational operates, and it says to the extent that anywhere in the world a company is not paying a 15% rate, then other countries have the right to tax that income. And it includes also the parent company's income. So it means that if because of credits or other incentives, a U.S. company is not paying a 15% rate in the U.S., other countries have the right to tax that income. And so taxing another jurisdiction's income is a treaty violation.
Can you elaborate on what actions countries are taking that might be considered as undermining the global tax deal? In your opinion, will this deal ever go into effect in countries like China, who are willing to always break the rules?
Yeah, so I think one of your colleagues brought up before some actions other countries are taking that are not consistent with the global deal. I don't think any country specifically has said we want to undermine it, but they're certainly taking actions that are not fully consistent with it.
Thank you. Mr. Michel, the OECD arrangement doesn't stop countries from competing to attract business, investment, and jobs. It just makes the current U.S. system less competitive. What makes this agreement, as currently written, so lopsided against the U.S. system? And what tools will countries use to compete if it is implemented?
As we've been discussing, I think the agreement shifts competition from tax rates, which ultimately reduce economic inefficiencies, and as we were talking about before, less costs get passed on to workers and consumers and investors, and instead shifts competition to a war over subsidies. There's already been reporting of countries saying they're going to compensate their largest businesses by passing on direct subsidies to compensate for the higher tax rates. And this just opens up a whole world of cronyism, of this sort of corruption that comes along with attaching specific payments to specific companies and the lobbying that goes on behind it.
So wouldn't you consider that all these subsidies and incentives is a type of global socialism?
It certainly incentivizes more government involvement in business decisions than simply lowering tax rates does.
So why would the United States negotiate our right to be a capitalist country? It just doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense to me either.
Okay, Ms. Gordon, there are likely numerous technical issues with the OECD model rules and guidance that have not received as much attention as the bigger concerns with the deal, which my Republican colleagues and I have been highlighting. Would you provide some examples that you're hearing from companies and your insight? And would you also tell me what your members' concerns are about sharing information, their information under Pillar 2?
Congresswoman, thank you for your question. I'll start with the second one. So there are a lot of concerns with sharing information and having sensitive tax information spread around the world as might be possible if you file a return with the IIR, the UTPR, the Global Information Return. As to the problems with Pillar 2, I mean, it's almost 6 o'clock, and so I don't want to keep us here all night. That being said, I think there are numbers of technical rules on, where are you filing your return, what information exactly is required when you file it, who gets to claim the UTPR. I mean, there are so many issues, and we've written hundreds of pages of comment letters that people could read later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
I want to thank all my colleagues, and to each of our witnesses, thank you for having a terrific and wonderful hearing this afternoon. Please be advised that the members have 2 weeks to submit their written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing of record. With that, the committee stands adjourned.